In 2025, America went through tests of fire, strife, and resilience, from the raging Los Angeles wildfires to its critical roles in the India-Pakistan and Iran-Israel wars. In natural disasters and international tensions, the unbreakable American spirit glowed, adapting and flourishing in adversity. With us as we look at the victories, challenges, and the lasting heritage of a nation that continues to mold the world. From its stunning landscapes to its multi-talented population, explore the whole history of the United States. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Millions lost their lives in search of conquering the unknown continent. European powers of those times participated in colonization, and centuries that followed saw incredible wars and an era of influence. These events gave rise to the creation of a new nation on July 4, 1776, the United States of America. Since then, the USA has dominated the world in all possible ways. From creating the most powerful military in the history of modern times, to infinite unbelievable human achievements, the nation has gained the title the modern Roman Empire. But can this behemoth maintain its dominance? To set the scene for the narrative of this captivating country, we have to begin right at the beginning. Far before European colonization, the native people of North America had created complex and advanced systems of government and society. Hundreds of thousands fought, reconciled, and ruled over certain areas and had done so for thousands of years. By the time of the first European explorers arriving on the North American continent during the 15th century, the Native Americans had developed and established themselves and their societies for thousands of years. The North American continent, so expansive and teeming with natural resources, would entice all who learned of its shores. And so when one Norse navigator, Leif Erikson, heard that there was land to the west of Greenland from fellow explorer Bjarni Herjolfsson, he made plans to sail. Herjolfsson, blown off route while on a journey, had by accident found what would one day be known as Newfoundland. And even though he did not make land, his account provided Erikson with the knowledge that allowed him to navigate successfully across the Labrador Sea and set foot on the shores of North America. Erikson and the Norsemen would go on to create a small colony in Labrador known as Lance Org Meadow or Meadows Cove. This colony, and many small fortified settlements constructed close to it, would be abandoned within a period of approximately 20 years. Afterward, it would be nearly another 500 years before Europeans set foot on the shores of North America. Searching for a more direct and faster route to India, the great European powers of the age sent dozens of expeditions around the globe. In October 1492, the Genovese explorer, Christopher Columbus, employed by the King and Queen of Spain, discovered the West Indies and inadvertently opened a new frontier of exploration. Popularized as the New World by Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, it was open season for European explorers, traders, and businessmen alike. European powers began claiming sections of this new world as their own with every major exploratory mission. Vespucci, who produced and marketed charts of his own discoveries in the New World, earned the famous reputation of having an entire hemisphere named after him, America. Although most of the initial exploration of the New World concentrated on what became the Caribbean and South America, soon enough explorers were looking north to the vast landmass beyond Columbus's Hispaniola. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Spanish, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, and French all entered a race to explore and map the entire east coast of North America. In 1497, Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot by his English employers, discovered the same region of Newfoundland that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled nearly 500 years earlier. Cabot's findings placed him in the position of discoverer of the North American continent since no evidence of Erikson's journey or colony had yet been found. To the south, Juan Ponce de Leon, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and Hernando de Soto would send expeditions through Florida and the American Southeast as Spain began to set up permanent colonies in the New World. Similarly to the north, Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River and Giovanni da Verrazzano charted much of the east coast for France. Throughout the coast, the Europeans met the many tribes of Native Americans. Initially, contacts were from friendly to hostile, as two different hemispheres' cultures first met. As it had in South America and the Caribbean, initial contact brought these cultures together with the exchange of gifts and information trading. As expected, These encounters brought Native Americans into contact with European diseases and resulted in widespread sickness and death. The first efforts at establishing permanent settlements within the New World were started in the mid-16th century with mixed results. Survival in the New World was not easy, and finding a settlement that was permanent was exceptionally difficult. The English tried in 1585 to create a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, located off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The passage over the Atlantic was hard and left the colonists with little provisions when they docked to encounter the local Aquascagok, Pamala, and Saconet tribes. The colonists, a large majority of whom were soldiers, were involved in a dispute with the Aquascagok and set their town ablaze. Conferences with the Saconet went much better, providing the colonists with sufficient food to get through a wretched winter. Smallpox and influenza outbreaks swept through each native village who came in contact with the colonists. The communication was disrupted, and brutality finally persuaded the colonists to continue their journey, leaving the colony behind. Their arrival in 1587, a year following the initial effort to settle Roanoke having failed, saw colonists, comprising mostly middle-class Londoners, and none with any experience of the military, landing on Croatoan Island, and setting about developing a settlement approximately 40 miles south of the initial failed settlement. The colony had extreme trouble surviving. In 1588, a relief expedition to the colony was raided by Spanish naval ships operating off the coast and left its new location unknown to English authorities. During the same year, Spanish ships traveled close to Croatoan Island and determined that it seemed deserted. The next relief expedition to the colony arrived in 1590 and discovered smoke coming from both Roanoke Island and Croatoan Island. A landing party found both settlements deserted and plundered. The sole indications were the letters CRO cut into a tree and the name Croatoan cut into one of the pillars of a palisade supposedly constructed by the Roanoke colony settlers. Described as one of the lost colony, Roanoke settlers were never found. The lost colony as recognized by the English government. In 1564, a number of French Huguenots colonists tried to establish a colony in what would eventually be St. Augustine, Florida, but the colony was pillaged and all of its male residents murdered by competing Spanish forces. The Spanish colonists' settlement at St. Augustine is recognized as the first permanent European settlement within North America. Parliament wished that the intolerable acts would quarantine the issue that appeared to be the most powerful in Massachusetts. The colonists, meanwhile, started taking action beyond mere committees of correspondence. The creation of the First Continental Congress in the autumn of 1774 served to counteract the intolerable acts and appealed to the British government for a repeal, like they did in 1765, concerning the Stamp Act. The king never got a formal response to the petition. With no response from the British government, in May 1775, the colonies gathered once more. The Second Continental Congress was again trying to stage a general boycott of British products and elicit some form of formal action from the Parliament when the tension which had held the American colonies in suspense since the close of the French and Indian War finally came to a head in a small village just outside Boston on a warm mid-April morning in 1775. On the night of April 18, 1775, with tensions high between Boston citizens and British soldiers quartered within and near the city, the Sons of Liberty learned that General Thomas Gage was to lead British soldiers to a storage of guns and powder located in Concord, only a few miles from Boston, and burn the cache. Patriots William Dawes and Paul Revere rode across the countryside of Boston and alerted the people that the regulars are mobilizing, or more commonly recalled, the British are coming. Colonial militiamen were awoken, collected their rifles, and raced to prevent the British forces from reaching Concord. On April 19, 1775, Massachusetts militiamen clashed with British regulars on Lexington Town Green. When told to put down their arms and disperse to their homes, the militiamen defied them and remained firm. Captain John Parker, in charge of the contingent of 70 or more Massachusetts militiamen, instructed them not to shoot unless shot at first. British officers commanded their troops to lower their guns, but warned them not to fire. In an instant, a single shot was fired. It is not known from whom the shot had come. Neither side would claim it, both accusing each other. With this instant, the shot heard around the world, The anger and resentment finally boiled over and the war started. When the American Revolution started, it did not begin as a revolution. Although undoubtedly the ideas it produced were revolutionary, the moves of the First Continental Congress were those of a legislative body seeking to achieve a degree of reconciliation with the mother country. More accurately described as a rebellion, the war's early phases were battled by the colonists to regain what they perceived as their birthright as British citizens and subjects. At home, initial successes for the militias maintained the flame of rebellion burning, but soon enough, the British began concerted efforts to suppress the rebellion. In the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, British forces assaulted earthworks occupied by the colonial militia outside Boston at the expense of a dearly bought triumph. It was becoming apparent to most that the colonies would be destroyed individually unless they stood together. While some of the representatives at the second session of the Continental Congress still acted with caution, hoping for a reconciliation, the Congress voted to create a unified army so that their troops would not be destroyed piecemeal. This new Continental Army would be led by a colonel from the colony of Virginia by the name of George Washington. Washington, who came from one of colonial Virginia's most influential families, had originally dreamed of becoming a naval officer in the English Navy when he was younger. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was cautious. She was aware that a seafaring life was a hard one and might result in premature death or being maimed. She urged her son not to join the Navy and to join the Army as a career instead. Washington complied and would spend most of his young adulthood trying to procure himself a commission with the British Army. He was a surveyor and won favor with the Royal Governor of Virginia in hopes of receiving that commission. It never materialized. Instead, Washington remained a colonel in the Virginia militia and practiced his own special brand of leadership, imitating the British. In this role, young George Washington was at the forefront of some of the most significant events of the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity and Battle of Monongahela, Washington was serving with British troops as a colonial officer, and despite surviving numerous close calls with death and leading his troops valiantly, he was never made an official offer for a commission in the British Army. More than a decade after the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was serving as a representative of Virginia at the Second Continental Congress. When the time for the Congress to choose who would command this new united army came, Washington was the obvious choice. Though his record on the battlefield was not great, his experience could not be doubted, and that he was a Virginian pleased most of the Southern Congress delegates, since the war to this point had been fought by, and virtually entirely occurred in, the northern colonies. During June 1775, after being given the unqualified endorsement of the Congress by a unanimous vote, Washington rode north to Boston and set about building the new Continental Army, the administrative framework it needed. The Continental Army had numerous problems. Supply was always a top priority. Shortage of food and dependable supply lines meant the army had to forage continually for food. This brought about a strained and occasionally violent relationship with the civilian populations surrounding where the armies had bivouacked. Differences in command afflicted the army too. In addition to dissatisfied and arrogant officers, this army was made up of soldiers from almost every once colony on the East Coast. These soldiers were as varied from one another as though they had come from a foreign nation. In one early example, General Washington actually had to pull men apart from one another in the midst of a snowball fight outside of Boston, which had devolved into a full-blown brawl between Massachusetts and Virginia soldiers. Unifying these men as a fighting unit was a war in itself. From the winter of 1775 to 76, the Continental Army redirected its efforts in two directions. In the north, the Congress sent an invasion of Quebec under Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery to hopefully enlist the Canadians to create a 14th colony and rebel against the British as well. It did not turn out so well, and although gains were achieved in upstate New York, the invasion eventually ended in gloomy defeat. Montgomery was killed and most of the force on the continent was captured or died from smallpox. Washington remained with the army near Boston and directed the siege. When 11,000 British soldiers were besieged in the city, Washington hoped the winter would starve them into submission, but he did not have the artillery to lay siege. He dispatched the young Colonel Henry Knox to retrieve cannons from recently taken Fort Ticonderoga, and in March 1776, Knox returned to Boston after successfully having the guns transported over the Berkshire Mountains during the winter. With Knox's artillery gazing down from Dorchester Heights, the British chose to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, the Continental Army retook possession of Boston, to the delight of the civilian populace. During the spring of 1776, the war was starting to expand to other areas of the 13 colonies. There was fighting in the Carolinas, and a British attempt at a siege of Charleston was foiled by a heroic defense of Sullivan's Island. In the upper part of New York, the remnants of the Canada expedition struggled to maintain the ground they had gained at Fort Ticonderoga and other strong points on Lake Champlain. Washington's army in Boston marched south to take New York City. The Continental Congress instructed Washington to defend the island city, even though they had no meaningful navy. Washington was not sure that his army, most of whom were untrained and undisciplined militia, would be able to withstand a British attack on the city. In Philadelphia, the new American capital, the Second Continental Congress had moved from a government institution, petitioning the British government for redress of grievances, to a government institution accountable for the conduct of a war. The Olive Branch Petition dispatched in July 1775 was the final attempt of the Congress to attempt reconciliation with the mother country. It had been greeted with the congressional labeling of the Congress as traitors and the revolution illegal. Following the move in Boston, it was evident to a segment of the Congress headed by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others that reverting to the pre-war status the American colonies in Great Britain had enjoyed was no longer an option. The need for independence had outstripped any reconciliation with England. Some of the representatives also came to the understanding that only through the help of a foreign power, that is France, could victory in this war be obtained. They knew France wouldn't come to the assistance of rebel colonists, but they might defend a sovereign state. As such, by early summer 1776, most of the provincial congresses were ready for full separation. On the 11th of June, the Congress established a committee to write a statement expressing the reason for their independence from Britain. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia wrote the Declaration of Independence mostly. It expressed in clear words the reason why the former colonies, now a state, wanted to separate and confirm the claim that they were entitled to make the separation as men. Following substantial rewrites to the initial drafts, including the excision of a paragraph denouncing the British slave trade, the declaration was accepted by Congress on July 2, 1776, and its final phrasing, duly ratified on July 4, 1776. Its most productive line stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The declaration altered the nature of the war from a rebellion to an outright revolution. The new colonies started functioning as independent and individual states loosely tied by their collective Congress. Washington made his soldiers read the declaration in New York City, spirits lifted. Finally, the soldiers of the Continental Army felt they had something to rally for, independence. The British retaliated in August 1776 by unleashing a string of deadly blows around and within New York City. As Washington had anticipated, his force was not ready for the professional and well-trained British Army, and without a navy, he stood no chance of holding on to the island of Manhattan. Having suffered 5 consecutive losses, Washington was compelled to leave New York City in British hands, and initiated a long and bloody retreat through New Jersey, and over the Delaware River, into Pennsylvania, late in November 1776. Lord William Howe, commander of the British forces in North America, chased Washington into New Jersey, and set up a series of garrisons, which ran from New York south, as far as Mount Holly. Washington realized that if he waited any longer, the war was lost. He came up with a plan to cross the Delaware on the night of December 25, 1776, and attack a vulnerable garrison in Trenton, New Jersey, held by a brigade of German mercenaries who were employed by the British, called Hessians. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve during a blinding nor'easter and led his exhausted and beleaguered troops south to Trenton. The Hessians were taken aback by the Continental Army's arrival, since fighting and maneuvering troops in winter was typically considered challenging and risky for 18th-century armies. He secured a quick victory fighting through the streets of Trenton and won his first battle as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. 9 days after, following a tactically masterful running fight on January 2nd, the Continental Army recorded another victory on the morning of January 3rd at Princeton, New Jersey. The 3 battles fought kept alive the Revolution during its lowest moment. In 1777, desperate to have things their way once again, the British launched 2 distinct offensives. The British, under Sir William Howe, took possession of the American capital of Philadelphia after Washington had been defeated at Brandywine and Germantown in the autumn of 1777. Although the loss of the capital was a setback to Continental Army morale, the army had not disintegrated, as it had been anticipated by Howe, and Washington led his troops to winter quarters at Valley Forge, a few miles west of Philadelphia. In New York State, British General John Burgoyne advanced his force south out of Canada, taking Fort Ticonderoga, and seeking to split New England from the rest of the United States, in an effort to force a quick end to the war. Burgoyne, however, encountered Continental Generals Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, engaging in a series of battles in the vicinity of Saratoga, New York. Due to excellent leadership by Arnold and wise strategy by Gates, Burgoyne's forces were defeated, and eventually obliged to surrender in October 1777. It was the largest British army ever to surrender an enemy force, up to that time, almost 7,000 men. The British defeat at Saratoga, combined with the twin triumphs of Trenton at Princeton during the winter campaign beforehand, persuaded the French that this new nation, these United States, had a very good hope of winning the war. Eager to get revenge after a century of losing to the British, the French declared a formal military alliance with the United States, declaring war on Great Britain and legitimizing the Declaration of Independence in one fell swoop. Great Britain was about to become embroiled in a global conflict again. Meanwhile, Washington spent the winter of 1777 to 78 training the Continental Army to fight the way European armies did. He was supported by the assistance of foreign officers, such as France's Marquis de Lafayette and Prussia's Baron von Steuben. Steuben especially gave the soldiers pride and trained them well. In 1778, when news of the official alliance with France reached them, the British evacuated Philadelphia and hastened back towards New York. Their new commander, Sir Henry Clinton, had little regard for the Continental Army, but a healthy respect for the French, and feared that their presence would drive the English into Philadelphia as a trap. Washington seized as the British retreated through New Jersey. His newly trained army attacked Clinton at Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778, and fought the British to a draw. Though the Battle of Monmouth was a draw, Washington's troops had performed well and held the British in an open field battle. The British retreated back to New York and would not move into New Jersey in any significant manner again. In 1779, the British were beginning to feel the pinch of a worldwide war. Seeing that the war could not be won in the north, the British sought out the south and more loyalist backing. British forces took Savannah and Charleston in the autumn of 1779 and thoroughly defeated General Horatio Gates at Camden in South Carolina. Gates was relieved of command, and one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, General Nathaniel Greene, took command of the Southern Department. Greene understood that the local population was not nearly as loyalist as the British hoped, and depended on the local militias and partisans to harry and harass the British supply chain. In 1780 and 1781, Greene and his other field officers drew the British away from the seacoast and into the Carolina backcountry, and there defeated them soundly at the Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpens. As the British continued to be drawn further from the Carolinas and into Virginia, the Carolinas erupted in a civil war as patriots battled loyalists for control of the states. Greene returned to the Carolinas to regain the states that were battling the British in a series of battles and pushing them back towards the coastal cities where they originated. In the summer of 1781, Greene's forces had been fighting almost continuously, as had the British Army under Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis realized he could no longer remain in the South and led his army north towards Yorktown, Virginia. The American and French combined forces marched south into the north to catch Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis was surrounded with his back to the ocean and no chance of rescue. He had to surrender after a siege that lasted a month. The Yorktown surrender was the final big military engagement of the American Revolution. Peace negotiations opened following the surrender and did not complete until nearly 2 full years later. Ultimately, the Treaty of Paris formally acknowledged the United States as an independent country and declared it free and independent from Great Britain. As the American Revolution intensified, the Continental Congress, having so declared independence, had not only the need to wage a war as a newly independent nation, but to also organize the now independent states in a loose confederation state. On November 15, 1777, Congress approved the Articles of Confederation, establishing a feeble central government which united the states only in their times of utmost conflict, like the current revolution. The Articles functioned throughout the war since they gave the Congress the authority to wage the war as a collective body and handle foreign nations the same way. After the war, though, it became evident that the lax system of central government was not going to be effective. In accordance with the Articles, the state governments held control over their own commerce, economy and loss, and although most of these overlapped, others did not, so there was chaos and confusion. The federal government was not able to arbitrate between states and controversies regarding state borders, taxation and foreign trade, soon started putting the government to a test. The United States was not even a decade old and already was on the verge of an economic and political catastrophe. One of the key signs that alteration was to be done came during fall of 1786, when the financial situation started resulting in wholesale foreclosures and bankruptcies. In Massachusetts, war veteran Daniel Shays organized a revolt of about 1,200 fellow veterans who had not been compensated for their service, nor had they been granted a pension, and took over the Massachusetts Supreme Court in Springfield, thus keeping the Massachusetts government from foreclosing on any property. They raided the new federal arsenal at Springfield, but failed to gain control of the grounds. Combat started taking place everywhere in the state as the rebellion widened. Luckily, the Massachusetts militia put down the rebels, dispersing them and ending combat. Meanwhile, it was evident the Articles of Confederation hindered the federal government's power in dealing with domestic problems as well as foreign affairs problems. The Treaty of Paris, having concluded the revolution, provided that debts incurred by Americans against British subjects had to be paid, and that loyalists could continue to pursue actions in United States courts to recover their seized property. Since every state was responsible for upholding these conditions, there were differences around the nation, as some did a better job of enforcing these conditions than others. The end result was British forces still holding forts and land which technically was now under United States jurisdiction, since the conditions of the treaty were not fulfilled. Having no power to intervene or direct the states to obey the treaty, the federal government was powerless. Having little choice, several states had a convention to make alterations in the Articles. In May of 1787, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia and started discussing the Articles of Confederation and what would take place to modify them. It was immediately apparent that the Articles were not effective, but what kind of government would be? A completely new design was suggested and fiercely argued. As would come to typify American politics, a number of compromises were negotiated to bring balance the states needed to ratify this new government form. This new constitution would create a system of checks and balances with 3 branches that would share the federal authority among themselves. The legislative branch, or the Congress, would be split into 2 houses: the House of Representatives, which would consist of state representatives proportional to the population of each state, and the Senate, which would have 2 representatives from each state. This branch of government can make and pass laws, impose taxes, declare war, override the veto of the president, establish federal courts, with the exception of the Supreme Court, and determines the number of justices on the Supreme Court. The Senate alone can approve presidential appointments to the judiciary, department heads and other federal positions, ratify treaties with foreign nations, impeach officials from office. The federal officials, including the president, can be impeached by the House of Representatives. The president elected by an electoral college would serve as the head of the executive branch, who would be entrusted with the power to execute, enforce or veto federal laws, appoint federal officers, grant pardons, and serve as the central role in all foreign policy matters. As commander-in-chief, the president was also responsible for commanding the military forces of the United States at the behest of Congress. The third branch, the judicial, would be a Supreme Court, established by the president and confirmed by the Congress. The Supreme Court is charged with interpreting the laws enacted by Congress and serves as the ultimate decision on issues of legality. In a subsequent Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, 1803, the Supreme Court included the decision as to which laws of Congress are unconstitutional. Whereas this check was not initially in the Constitution, it is a vital component of the operation of the court, government by the people for the people. It was the first time any country's constitution mentioned, including the people as being involved in the formation and legitimacy of the government. The Constitution was written in September 1787 and sent to the Congress of the Confederation. Rather than the article amendments they were anticipating, the Constitution presented a completely different system of government. Instant controversy arose because the Constitution had to be ratified, and not by each state unanimously as under the Articles of Confederation, but by a 2/3 majority. In October 1787, the initial of 85 pamphlets defending the Constitution appeared and circulated broadly. They are known as the Federalist Papers, and were printed anonymously then. While we recognize now that its writers were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison and John Jay, two groups soon formed in favor. On one hand were the Federalists, in support of the Constitution and a strong central government. Against them were the Anti-Federalists, who believed that the Constitution was too strong and took away from the authority of the state governments. The states ratified the Constitution individually, however. It had become too necessary for a change in government, and most of the states knew that this Constitution would be their best alternative. The states officially ratified the Constitution between 1787 to 88, and on June 21, 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, cast its affirmative vote, and the Constitution became the land's new law. George Washington, hero of the American Revolution, was chosen early in 1789 to become the first president of the United States. John Adams, who had the second most votes, was chosen his vice president. Although Washington did not take sides with either of the Federalist or Anti-Federalists groups that had set in, he did support Federalist policies to make the new government stronger. He astutely populated his cabinet with the greatest political minds of the time, both Federalist and Anti-Federalists, such as Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. Throughout his time in office, Washington tried to concentrate on the numerous internal problems of the nation. Washington pressured the Congress into enacting tariffs on foreign imports to try to collect revenue for the federal government, and collaborated with his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, to enact a series of economic measures and legislation that would establish a national bank and give the government a national debt. He chose the permanent site for the future capital of the United States and would be named Washington, District of Columbia, in honor of the first president. When crisis struck, Washington took his position as commander-in-chief, very literally. In 1790, as a response to the Distilled Spirits Duties Act or Whiskey Act, which taxed domestically distilled spirits, farmers in western Pennsylvania started an armed uprising. They assaulted tax collectors and fought the federal forces, so Washington called in the Pennsylvania and Virginia militias to active duty. He personally commanded the troops into western Pennsylvania, and with a bit of display of force, his commissioners were able to negotiate the end of what came to be called the Whiskey Rebellion. In foreign affairs, Washington was beset on all sides by attacks. In France, their former ally, King Louis XVI, had lost hold of his government and people, leading to an increasingly bloody revolution. Menace from Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean was poised to interrupt a tenuous American sea trade. England had started impressment, or the robbing of sailors and vessels from other countries, prompting Washington to seek satisfaction. Sending his political ally and friend John Jay to England, Washington hoped to gain a friendly trade agreement and end American impressment. Jay returned with a treaty, and served the American government ably in Washington's opinion, uniting Great Britain and the United States further. The Jay Treaty, on the other hand, infuriated pro-French elements in his administration and throughout the nation. Washington was re-elected in 1792, with Adams once again serving as his vice president. He continued to battle the new French Republic, as in 1793 they guillotined King Louis XVI and were embroiled in a series of revolutionary wars. Washington continued to push hard on his vision of American isolation from Europe, much to the dismay of the pro-French members of his cabinet, such as Thomas Jefferson. In 1793, In his second term, Washington was compelled to relocate himself and the government from their temporary capital in Philadelphia because of a yellow fever epidemic. The government relocated to Trenton, New Jersey, where the Continental Congress had briefly met in 1784. Washington fought an increasing breach within his administration. The Anti-Federalists, now known as the Democratic Republicans, became progressively further apart ideologically from the Federalists. Washington feared the two-party system and cautioned time and again that their presence might result in a severe division within the government. The Washington administration established a lot of precedent for the United States government and the office of the president. Whether it was initiating domestic policies to foreign intervention or the absence of it, Washington established the pattern for his successors. His last official act as president was to resign. Although Congress had not yet put any term limits on the president's office, it was generally assumed that Washington would just stay president or create some sort of dynasty, kind of like a king. In fact, after serving 2 terms, Washington resigned and did not seek office for a 3rd term. His replacement, who was elected narrowly in 1797, was John Adams, whose foreign policy woes were as great or greater than Washington's. Conditions in France deteriorated further into what became known as the Reign of Terror. Adams carried on Washington's isolationism and continued to distance the United States from France. In turn, the revolutionary government of France started an unofficial war, or quasi-war, against the United States. The combat was maintained mostly at sea, and consisted of a series of naval battles with America's new navy. At home, Adams grew more and more unpopular among the Democratic Republicans for his alien and sedition acts, which gave the government the power to arrest or silence any person who criticized the actions of the Adams administration towards France. Bedeviled by those of his own party, and members of the opposition as well, Adams took it upon himself to negotiate an agreement with France and end his administration on a peaceful note. In his last year in office, Adams and his wife Abigail were the first presidential couple to occupy the White House in the new Capitol in Washington, D.C. They occupied and operated out of the building while it was assembled around them. Adams campaigned once more, expecting that his reconciliation with France would come back into favor, but was defeated by Thomas Jefferson in early stages of the election process. The administration of Thomas Jefferson brought 25 years of Democratic-Republican rule of the executive branch. Jefferson's administration quickly moved to reverse the harm they perceived Washington and Adams' administrations had caused. Jefferson labored to lower the debt that had been built up, trimming the budget as low as he could. He downsized the Army and Navy and repealed the whiskey tax that had been problematic for Washington's presidency. Similar to Washington and Adams, Jefferson also had to deal with piracy in the Mediterranean. He used an American naval squadron to decisively defeat the Barbary pirates and compelled them to surrender. Unlike his predecessors, Jefferson actively cooperated with the new French government, which was now dominated by Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte, wanting to raise quick money and eliminate some vestigial colonial properties, sold the Louisiana Territory to Jefferson's government in 1803, opening up a whole new frontier to Americans. The next year, Jefferson commissioned the use of the Corps of Discovery, guided by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, to send an expedition up the Missouri River and beyond the Continental Divide. Their objectives were to chart the new country in order to discover a viable path through the west half of the continent, and to put an American presence on the west prior to Europeans' opportunity to stake claims. Assisted by a Shoshan woman named Sacagawea, who acted as an interpreter, the party established contact with more than 70 Indian tribes, drew 140 maps and recorded over 200 new plant and animal species. Jefferson's second term was tainted by the Napoleonic Wars that were taking place in Europe. Both the British and French navies now actively attacked American ships and sailors, leading to violation of America's neutral shipping rights. Jefferson responded with an embargo on American shipping. It was extremely unpopular and even more extremely unsuccessful, harming Jefferson's efforts to balance the budget before his second term lapsed. As unpopular as the Democratic Republicans were at the end of Jefferson's presidency, his protégé James Madison was the 4th president of the United States elected. Madison, who had played such an important role in the Constitutional Convention, had inherited an entangled and cumbersome relationship with England and France, along with growing tension in the United States. Madison extended Jefferson's embargo during the initial 2 years of his presidency, understanding that commerce was essential for the United States' improvement, and on the request of Congress, Madison reopened American shipping to England and France, requesting them again to respect America's neutrality. Of course, the impressment of sailors and capture of ships resumed almost at once. A delegation of young congressmen, in this case, 2 men by the names of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, pursued the president with a call for greater force. These warhawks, as they would come to be known, pressed Madison to pursue a more aggressive attitude toward France and Britain. Escalating tension along the American interior further fueled the flames. The British had been accused of equipping and providing for a native rebellion on the border, and British soldiers still occupied forts which were owned by the United States. Following British vessels openly attacking American seamen right off the coast of America, Madison succumbed to the warhawks and requested that Congress declare war on June 1, 1812. The people of America were prepared for war with Britain, but its military and marine forces were not. In 3 distinct invasions of Canada, the United States was beaten and repelled with 2 out of 3 armies compelled to surrender, while not entirely without some successes. One of the invasions had culminated in the destruction of the city of York, the capital of the province in Canada. Naval engagements went much better. In one battle, the USS Constitution and the HMS Guerriere clashed in a short-lived naval battle that did not last more than an hour. The British were shocked to discover that their cannonballs simply ricocheted off of the Constitution's 22-inch opening. The USS Constitution would continue to devastate the British Navy during the war. Many native tribes banded together under the leadership of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, or Lalethika, known as the Prophet. Tecumseh's confederacy of tribes sided with the British in the last desperate gamble to establish control over the continued American expansion west. The American military was kept at bay by the British and Tecumseh's confederacy in Canada, where Tecumseh was eventually killed during the Battle of the Thames in 1813. The confederacy of tribes was broken by Tecumseh's death and eventually pulled them out of the war. The British, however, went on the attack and invaded American lines along the Chesapeake, targeting the capture of the United States capital, Washington, D.C. In August of 1814, the British sailed successfully up the Patuxent River to the south of Washington and put troops ashore who advanced on the U.S. capital city. A disastrous defense of the city at Bladensburg left the U.S. capital city of Washington, D.C. exposed to attack and occupation. Madison was compelled to evacuate in the White House and observed the disaster from a distance. His wife, Dolly Madison, saw that if the city fell into British hands, they would pillage and probably burn the many government structures. Mrs. Madison had her enslaved servant Paul Jennings remove and save the renowned copy of the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, which was prominently displayed in the White House. Dolly's caution was prophetic, for when the British soldiers occupied Washington, they did burn many government buildings, among them the as yet unfinished U.S. Capitol, the Treasury, the Department of War, and White House. While the city was burning, a hurricane, timely and fast, sped up the coast, extinguishing the flames, and in one documented instance, swept up 2 cannons and hurled them a few yards away, slaying British troops and American civilians alike. Although the British had been able to capture and burn the U.S. Capitol, they were made to leave the city since holding onto it would be impossible with any further reinforcement, and the hurricane had destroyed much of their fleet on the Patuxent River. Madison went back to the devastated capital and proceeded to pursue the war. Later that month, British naval attempts at taking the city of Baltimore were foiled at the siege of Fort McHenry, when British ships shelled the fort by way of a deadly battle which continued into the night. During rev in the morning, Fort McHenry hoisted its giant star-spangled banner flag as it geared up for another day of battle. Instead, the British fleet returned out into the sea, not wanting to fight more American positions, and started redirecting resources away from attacking New Orleans in Louisiana. The bombardment of Fort McHenry and the location of the gigantic American flag during the morning of September 14, 1814, moved American lawyer Francis Scott Key to write a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry. The lyrics of the poem, to the melody of an old British tavern song, would later become the United States national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The British launched a final attempt at making an offensive push onto the American continent near the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. with the aim of gaining control of the Mississippi River. British troops landed a few miles south of New Orleans and tried to march on the city. The defense of the city was commanded by a flamboyant commander by the name of Andrew Jackson, whose motley force of defenders consisted of pirates, militia, free blacks and regulars. In January 1815, unaware that the United States and England had made their peace treaty arrangements in December 1814, British troops advanced on New Orleans and fought one final battle. Jackson's motley defenders repelled a number of waves of British soldiers and secured an amazing albeit rather late triumph for America. Despite the fact that the War of 1812 is not well known today, it had numerous lasting effects throughout for the United States and citizens of North America. Beyond a doubt, the war was most affected by not any land that was taken, but the final extinguishing of hope for the Native Americans to have any form of sovereignty over their territory. In the treaty, the British had insisted on the creation of an Indian state within the Great Lakes, but the United States had rejected the proposal outright. The dam was ready to break for Western growth, and there was nothing and nobody left to stem the tide from washing away the native tribes remaining. Globally, most of the European powers expected the United States to not be able to persevere. The experiment of greatness would have played itself out in these backward farmers, and high-hatted intellectuals would have dismembered the nation. Rather, on the very public world stage, the United States had once again declared war upon the world's most powerful empire and brought them to a stalemate. Though there was very little land gained through the Treaty of Ghent, the message was unmistakable. The United States was here, and they were here to remain, at least as long as it could hold itself together. As the 19th century wore on, Americans were infatuated with the idea of continentalism, that someday the United States would stretch from sea to shining sea and blanket the North American continent. The Treaty of Ghent did little to promote the land that belonged to the United States after the War of 1812, though Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had added land to the United States, right up to the Rocky Mountains. Political agreements with Spain and Great Britain aided in the expansion and definition of these borders well through the 1820s, and Americans grew more hungry to complete this continental vision. Meanwhile, President James Monroe's 1823 issued a warning to European powers that the Western Hemisphere was no longer theirs to toy around with, and that the United States would assert its influence as the preponderant power in the area if they tried to colonize here again. The word was clear, and a thought started taking shape in the minds of the American nation. This nation is not for the Europeans and never was. It is meant for the people of the United States. The phrase manifest destiny itself was first used in the 1840s amid increasing dispute over Oregon country control, but it now includes the entire period of U.S. westward expansion, feeling that they were absolutely destined to occupy all of the continent, and seeking an opportunity to redeem what some felt was sinful and ungodly. West, Americans sought to expand their farmlands and economy west of the Mississippi River, and remake the West in an evangelical form of the agrarian East. In their path were the proud remnants of Eastern Native American tribes, and the Western tribes who were not willing to yield any more land without resisting. In addition, the few remaining European colonies in North America, that is to say, Great Britain and Spain, and by 1824, a newly independent Mexico, would not just roll over and permit the United States to spread without any hindrance. When he bought the Louisiana Territory, President Jefferson wished to make long-term diplomatic relations with the hundreds of tribes of the West, and as became the practice throughout the 19th century, hoped to civilize and Americanize the tribes. It was not long though before the plans to assimilate the Native Americans evolved into plans to remove and relocate them, particularly in the wake of the War of 1812. Plans for the establishment of Indian territories had been written as early as 1824, during the administration of James Monroe, to drive out the Cherokee Indians from their traditional lands east of the Mississippi and relocate them west. It was in 1829 that President Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 hero, made those plans real, persuading Congress to enact the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The act compelled the 5 civilized tribes, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, to leave their homelands and resettle west. It was a forced relocation, with over 60,000 individuals taken from their households and moved past the Mississippi River. The removal had some minor skirmishes, but in the end, the tribes were forced to depart. Referenced as the Trail of Tears, the trails traveled by these tribes were grueling and claimed the lives of approximately 15,000 natives. Frontiersmen traveled west to farm, mine and ranch, usually discovering the land to be unfriendly and hazardous. Along the way they experienced battles with Indians, cholera and typhoid fever epidemics, harsh winters with no food and other adversities. Around 70,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints migrated to the Salt Lake Valley from their homesteads in Illinois, starting in 1847, referred to as the Mormon Exodus. Hundreds of thousands of emigrants employed the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile journey from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. Land speculators sold inexpensive lots with the promise of unlimited opportunity, prompting thousands to venture out. During the winter of 1846-47, members of the ill-fated Donner Party were making their way west by wagon train on the Oregon Trail, but got snowed in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Party members had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. The overland trip was so hazardous and challenging that some westbound immigrants instead used the 6-month sea route around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Gold was found in the Sierra Nevada foothills in California in 1848, which had entered the U.S. in the same year as a result of the Mexican-American War. After the word spread about the gold, men from far and wide looked for their fortune in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in what later came to be known as the Gold Rush. In 1849, San Francisco's population rose from a mere 812 to 20,000 individuals, with the prospectors who arrived that year being referred to collectively as the 49ers. Land, goods, and services became ridiculously expensive. Individuals had the potential to earn more money selling such products and services to prospectors than they would from doing the actual gold mining. Since men outnumbered women in these towns significantly, work traditionally done by women such as washing clothes and cooking became very much in demand, and as a result, very lucrative. However, gold was definitely discovered. The stampede yielded an average of 76 tons of gold annually, and it was estimated that by the close of the 1850s $550 million worth of gold had been taken out, equaling approximately $187 billion in the present day. The tens of thousands who had gone west required rapid mail service for news and correspondence from the east. Although several mail carriers across the Rocky Mountains did exist, the most renowned was the Pony Express. Established in 1860, the company employed relays of horse-mounted riders riding day and night at breakneck speeds to transport mail between California and Missouri, which it was able to do in roughly 10 days. It lasted only 18 months before the first transcontinental telegraph was opened in 1861, but it was important to link the new state of California with the rest of America. As Americans started to settle in the West, more skirmishes with the native tribes present there resulted in further hostilities, and the United States military became almost permanently quartered in other forts in the Midwest, as well as along the West Coast. The Texas region of the American Southwest had been ceded to Spain in the 1810s, but after the Mexican War of Independence in 1821, and the official establishment of the Mexican Republic only 3 years later, the territory was included in Mexico. Texas was remote from the heart of the Mexican government of Saltillo, and contained fewer than 4,000 inhabitants scattered over the huge region. Seeking to boost immigration to the state, and with the hope that the resulting population increase would discourage Indian raids, the Mexican government made available cheap land, as well as significant financial incentives for individuals who would settle in the state. Immigrants who came to the state largely originated in the American South, and brought with them the region's culture and mindset, as well as slavery. In 1829, Mexico abolished slavery, and after the Anglo citizens had almost caused a rebellion, the Mexican president also prohibited further immigration to Texas by United States citizens. In Texas, the Anglo citizens disregarded the laws and soon outnumbered the Mexican-born citizens of the state. When in 1834, Antonio López de Santa Anna staged a successful coup of the Mexican government, the Texans were initially delighted since Santa Anna promptly reversed many of the acts and legislation of his predecessors. But Santa Anna went much beyond this and dissolved the political institutions of all the Mexican states, imposing a dictatorship over the nation. In 1835, aided by both the Anglos and Tejanos populations, the Texans revolted, seeking to gain independence from Mexico. Late in February 1836, the most renowned battle of the Texas Revolution commenced with the besieging of the Alamo Mission. Fenced by fewer than 300 Texans, the walls of the mission were converted into a crude fort. Its defenders were Colonel William Travis, James Bowie, and former U.S. Congressman and folk hero Davy Crockett. The Texans were surrounded and laid siege to for 13 days by Santa Anna's troops before the third night attack on March 6, 1836. The battle was savage, and Santa Anna instructed there should not be any prisoners taken. The few prisoners who had survived the massacre were also put to death. The fight of the Alamo served as a clarion call to the Texans, who continued to battle and galvanized the Army of Texas in the weeks that ensued. A month and a bit later, the Texas Revolution came to an end in triumph for the Texans following the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. The Texas Revolution was a brief affair, lasting less than a year, and resulted in the founding of the Republic of Texas. Naturally, the largely American citizens of the new republic quickly started petitioning the government of the United States to annex the republic and bring it into the expanding Union. In spite of vehement debate regarding the admission of what would rightly be another slave state into the Union, fewer than 10 years passed before Texas was annexed by the United States. The annexation of Texas also led to another war with Mexico in 1846. Since the borders of the Republic of Texas were ill-defined and disputed between Mexico, when the United States annexed Texas, Mexico alleged that the United States was appropriating Mexican territory. President James K. Polk tried negotiating with the Mexican government and proposing that they pay for the disputed land, as well as the California, New Mexico and Arizona land. The Mexican government declined. As a result, Polk deployed troops to take over the disputed land, leading to Mexican forces attacking the small American troop. Polk used the incident to persuade Congress to declare war on Mexico. Mexico's military was armed with leftover Napoleonic flintlock weapons, whereas the United States had much more advanced armaments. Ill-organized, under-equipped, and subject to internal political conflict at every management level, the Mexican armies were hardly a match for either the American Army or Navy, who swiftly overran enormous portions of Mexico and its lands. When the Mexican government eventually failed, they were compelled to cede huge tracts of land to the United States, California and New Mexico among them, along with the embarrassment of having to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Republic of Texas and its subsequent annexation in 1845. Lasting from April 1846 until February 1848. The Mexican-American War was a one-sided conflict and openly showed America's goals to gain domination of the North American continent. There were numerous dissidents to the idea of manifest destiny, particularly among the Whig Party, the inheritors of the Federalists, such as by the mid-19th century, young Illinois politician Abraham Lincoln. In 1844, manifest destiny came to the forefront as territorial conflicts with Great Britain regarding Oregon and the continuing tensions with Mexico regarding the Texas territory divided political parties even further. As Western states increased in number and were being talked about joining the Union, whether or not these territories would prohibit or permit slavery was a question of importance. The delicate power balance in Congress between slave states and free states was threatened. Since the first African slaves disembarked in Virginia in 1619, the institution of slavery had become increasingly entrenched in society. Parliament retained hope that the intolerable acts would quarantine the issue that appeared to be most vigorous in Massachusetts. The colonists meanwhile started moving into actions more substantial than mere committees of correspondence. The creation of the First Continental Congress of the fall of 1774 set about correcting the intolerable acts and requested a repeal from the British government, as they had done in 1765 with the Stamp Act. The appeal to the king never got a formal response. Without a response from the British government, in May 1775, the colonies once again met. The Second Continental Congress was once more trying to mobilize a general boycott of British commodities and get some sort of formal reaction from the Parliament, when the tension which had held the American colonies in its grip ever since the conclusion of the French and Indian War finally culminated in a breaking point, in a tiny village just outside Boston, on a warm mid-April morning in 1775. On the night of April 18, 1775, tensions high between Bostonians and British soldiers quartered in and around the city. The Sons of Liberty learned system, that General Thomas Gage was going to send British troops to a storehouse of weapons and gunpowder buried in Concord, only a few miles from Boston, and burn up the depot. Patriots, Paul Revere, and William Dawes rode the countryside of Boston and alerted the citizens that the regulars are coming out, or as it is better remembered, the British are coming. 130 colonists, militiamen, stirred from their beds, took up their muskets, and hastened to prevent the British soldiers from reaching Concord. On the morning of April 19, 1775, Massachusetts militiamen clashed with British regulars on the Lexington town green. When they were told to put down their arms and go home, the militiamen defied orders and stood firm. Captain John Parker, in command of the band of 70 or so Massachusetts militiamen, ordered them not to shoot unless shot at first. British officers commanded their men to lower their muskets, but warned them not to shoot. Out of the blue, a shot was fired. Nobody knows where it came from. Neither side asserted, each accusing the other. With this event, the shot heard around the world, the anger and resentment finally boiled over, and the war commenced. When the American Revolution started, it wasn't a revolution in the making. Though assuredly the philosophy it produced was revolutionary, the behavior of the initial Continental Congress was that of a legislative assembly seeking to achieve some type of reconciliation with the mother country. More accurately described as a rebellion, its early phases were fought by the colonists to recover what they perceived as their birthright as British subjects and citizens. Early home front victories for the militias continued to keep the flame of rebellion burning, but soon enough it was not long before the British set their minds to crushing the rebellion. In June 1775, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, British troops assaulted earthworks occupied by the colonial militia, just outside of Boston at the high cost of a bloody victory. It was dawning on many that unless the colonies came together, they would be beaten one by ascended the throne by one. Although some of the representatives to the Continental Congress, now in its second session, continued to exercise caution, thinking a reconciliation might yet be possible, the Congress voted to create one army as opposed to many different ones, in order to avoid their armies being destroyed piecemeal. And leading this new Continental Army would be a Virginia colonel by the name of George Washington. Washington, who was born into one of colonial Virginia's most distinguished families, had dreamed as a young man of becoming a naval officer in the English Navy. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was suspicious. She recognized that a seafaring life was a hard one and might find him dead or maimed before his time. She urged her son not to join the Navy and to join the Army instead. Washington complied and would spend the majority of his early adult years trying to obtain a commission in the British Army. He worked as a surveyor and ingratiated himself with the royal governor of Virginia, hoping to receive that commission. It never materialized. Rather, Washington acted as a colonel in the Virginia militia and pursued his own special brand of command, an imitation of the British. Acting in that role, young George Washington was at the forefront of some of the most pivotal events of the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity and the Battle of Monongahela, Washington acted as a colonial officer in concert with British troops, and for all his surviving a series of near-death experiences and fighting his men bravely, he was never formally approached with an offer of a commission in the British Army. Well over a decade after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, Washington served as a Virginia representative in the Second Continental Congress. When the time came to choose who would command this new united army, Washington was the obvious selection. Though his record in the field was not impressive, his experience was beyond question, and the fact that he was a Virginian was satisfying to many of the Southern members of Congress, as the war to date had been fought by, and nearly wholly was confined to, the northern colonies. In June 1775, following a unanimous vote of approbation from the Congress, Washington traveled north to Boston and set about building the infrastructure required for the new Continental Army. The Continental Army had numerous problems. Supply was always the prime concern. Shortage of food and dependable supply lines meant that the army had to constantly scrounge for food. This resulted in a strained and occasionally violent relationship with the civilian communities adjacent to where the armies had encamped. Disagreements regarding command also beset the army. In addition to irate and privileged officers, this army was made up of men from almost every East Coast colony. These troops were as divergent from one another as if they had been recruited from a foreign land. In one early example, General Washington had to literally pull soldiers off of one another in a snowball battle outside of Boston, which had devolved into a full-blown brawl between Massachusetts and Virginia soldiers. Unifying these men as a fighting unit was a war in and of itself. Over the winter of 1775 through 76, the Continental Army redirected its efforts in two ways. To the hither side, the Congress dispatched an invasion of Quebec, led by Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, on the assumption that they would be able to enlist the Canadians to make them a 14th colony and join in rebellion against the British as well. It did not turn out quite like that. And though there was success gained in upstate New York, the invasion amounted to a resounding failure. Montgomery was slain, and most of the Continental Army was captured or died from smallpox. Washington remained with the troops near Boston and conducted the siege. There were 11,000 British soldiers besieged in the city, and Washington expected them to surrender as winter tightened its grip, but he did not have enough artillery to execute a full-scale siege. He dispatched the young Colonel Anthony Knox to obtain artillery from the newly taken Fort Ticonderoga, and in March 1776, Knox arrived in Boston, having successfully negotiated the getting of the guns over the Berkshire Mountains during the winter. With Knox's guns staring down from Dorchester Heights, the British resolved to evacuate the city. On the 17th of March, 1776, the Continental Army reoccupied Boston to the delight of the civilian population. During the spring of 1776, the conflict was starting to expand outside other sections of the 13 colonies. Fighting had commenced in the Carolinas, and a British siege of Charleston was repelled by a courageous defense of Sullivan's Island. In northern New York, the remnants of the Canada expedition battled to retain the advances they had gained at Fort Ticonderoga and other strategic positions on Lake Champlain. Washington's army in Boston marched south to take possession of New York City. The Continental Congress instructed Washington to hold the island city, even though there was no effective navy. Washington was not sure his army, which consisted largely of untrained and undisciplined militia, was going to be able to hold off a British attack on the city. In Philadelphia, the American capital city at this time, the Second Continental Congress had evolved from a governmental committee petitioning the British government for redress of grievances to a governmental committee answerable for direction of a war. The Olive Branch petition addressed to England in July 1775 had been the final effort of the Congress to negotiate with the mother country. It had already been followed by the labeling of the Congress as traitors and of the Revolution as illegal. Following the action at Boston, it had become evident to some members of the Congress, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others, that a return to pre-war conditions the American colonies in Great Britain had enjoyed was no longer feasible. The need for autonomy had overtaken any likely reconciliation with England. Most of the representatives also understood that a triumph in this war could be attained only with the help of an alien power, that is, France. They were aware that France would never help a rebel colony, but they might help a sovereign country. Thus, by early summer 1776, most of the provincial congresses were ready for full separation. On June 11th, Congress appointed a committee to prepare a document asserting the reasons for their separation from Great Britain. The Declaration of Independence was penned almost entirely by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. It set forth in plain language the cause of the former colonies, now states, wish for separation, and confirmed the statement that they had a right as men to effect the separation. Following extensive changes to the initial drafts, including the deletion of a passage denouncing the British slave trade, Congress adopted the Declaration on the 2nd of July, 1776, and its definitive wording was officially ratified on the 4th of July, 1776. Its most productive phrase stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Declaration transformed the nature of the war from a rebellion into a full-fledged revolution. The new colonies started functioning as independent and sovereign states, loosely tied together by their common Congress. Washington had his soldiers read the Declaration in New York City, morale soared. Finally, the Continental Army soldiers felt they had something to rally behind, freedom. The British responded in August 1776 with a series of devastating assaults around and within New York City. Washington's army, as he had feared, was ill-equipped to face the professional and well-trained British army, and without a navy, he could not hope to hold the island of Manhattan. After 5 consecutive losses, Washington was obliged to evacuate New York City to the British and initiated a long and bloody withdrawal into New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, later in November 1776. Lord William Howe, commander of the British forces in North America, pursued Washington into New Jersey and set up a line of garrisons, which ran from New York as far south as Mount Holly. Washington understood that if he did not move swiftly, the war would be lost. He came up with a plan to cross the Delaware on the 25th of December, 1776, and assault a vulnerable garrison in Trenton, New Jersey, held by a brigade of German mercenaries employed by the British, called Hessians. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night in a blinding nor'easter, and led his weary and beleaguered troops south to Trenton. The Hessians were taken aback by the presence of the Continental Army, because it was typically considered to be hard and hazardous work to fight and move troops during the winter months for 18th century armies. He won a quick victory fighting through the streets of Trenton, and won his first battle commanding the Continental Army. 9 days thereafter, following a tactically brilliant running battle on the 2nd of January, the Continental Army once again gained victory on the morning of the 3rd of January at Princeton, New Jersey. The 3 battles fought preserved the Revolution at its lowest point. In 1777, desperate to take command again, the British initiated 2 distinct offensives. The British, under the command of Sir William Howe, captured the American capital city of Philadelphia, following their victories over Washington at Brandywine and Germantown in the autumn of 1777. Although the loss of the capital was disappointing to the Continental Army's morale, the army had not disintegrated, as Howe had hoped that it would, and Washington withdrew his troops to spend the winter at Valley Forge, just a few miles to the west of Philadelphia. British General John Burgoyne led his forces south out of Canada into upstate New York, capturing Fort Ticonderoga, and intent on splitting New England from the remainder of the United States, with a view to ending the war abruptly. Instead, Burgoyne met with Continental Generals Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, fighting a series of battles around Saratoga, New York. Due to masterful leadership by Arnold and wise strategy by Gates, Burgoyne's force was defeated and ultimately compelled to capitulation in October 1777. It was the largest British force ever to surrender to an enemy up until that time, almost 7,000 men. The British defeat at Saratoga, complemented by the twin triumphs of Trenton and Princeton of the winter campaign last year, persuaded the French that this new nation, these United States, actually stood a chance of winning the war. Looking forward to avenging a century of defeat at the hands of the British, the French declared a solemn war alliance with the United States, declaring war on Great Britain and sanctioning the Declaration of Independence in the process. Great Britain was soon to find itself involved in another world conflict. While that, Washington spent the winter of 1770-78 preparing the Continental Army to conduct war in the European manner. He was helped with assistance from foreign officers, such as the Marquis de Lafayette of France and the Baron von Steuben of Prussia. Steuben especially brought a sense of pride to the soldiers and taught them well. In 1778, when the news reached that there had been the official alliance with France, the British evacuated Philadelphia and hastened back towards New York. Their new commander, Sir Henry Clinton, never had any great opinion of the Continental Army, but did have a wholesome respect for the French, and dreading their presence was to isolate the English in Philadelphia. Washington seized the moment as the British marched out through New Jersey. His freshly trained fighting men attacked Clinton at Monmouth, New Jersey, on June 28, 1778, and battled the British to a draw. Although the Battle of Monmouth was a draw, Washington's troops had battled well and repelled the British in an open field battle. The British retreated back to New York, and never again penetrated New Jersey in any significant manner. In 1779, the British felt the weight of a world war. Having given up on winning the war in the north, the British shifted their focus to the south in the hopes of gaining more loyalist support. The British captured Savannah and Charleston in the fall of 1779 and decisively defeated General Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. Gates was relieved of duty, and one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, General Nathaniel Greene, was made head of the Southern Department. Greene understood that the local people were not anywhere near as loyalist as the British assumed and used the local militia and partisans to harass and harry the British supply lines. In 1780 and 1781, Greene and his other field commanders drew the British away from the coast and into the Carolina backcountry, where they were decisively defeated in the Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpens. As the British were drawn ever farther away from the Carolinas and into Virginia, the Carolinas erupted into a civil war as patriots contested loyalists for dominance over the states. Greene returned to the Carolinas to regain the states, battling the British in a series of battles and pinning them back toward the coastal towns from which they began. Greene's army, along with the British army commanded by Charles Cornwallis, was tired from the continual fighting during the summer of 1781. Cornwallis realized he could no longer remain in the South and led his army north to Yorktown, Virginia. In the north, American and French armies marched south to meet Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis was trapped with his back against the sea and no possibility of rescue. He surrendered after a month-long siege. The Battle of Yorktown was the final big military action of the American Revolution. Negotiations for peace began after the Battle of Yorktown and didn't wrap up until almost 2 full years later. In the end, the Treaty of Paris officially established the United States as a sovereign state and made it independent and free from Great Britain. As the American Revolution progressed, the Continental Congress, having now declared independence, faced not only the challenge of waging war as a newly independent nation, but also to bind the now independent states together in a loose confederation government. On the 15th of November, 1777, Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, establishing a frail national government that united the states only during periods of extreme strife, like the current war. The Articles functioned during the war because they provided Congress with the authority to carry on the war as a corporate body and negotiate with foreign powers as a body. Once the war had been fought and won, though, it became clear that the loose framework of federal government was not going to be feasible. Under the Articles, the state governments controlled their own commerce, economy, and laws outright. And although many of these overlapped, some did not, and so there was chaos and confusion. The federal government was unable to broker the disagreements between states, and disagreements over state borders, taxation, and foreign commerce started to drive the government to the brink. The country was less than a decade old and was already experiencing an economic and political crisis. One of the chief signals that alteration had to be implemented came in the autumn of 1786, when the economic climate started to cause en masse foreclosures as well as bankruptcies. In Massachusetts, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, Daniel Shays, instigated a rebellion of about 1,200 other veterans who had not been compensated for their service, nor given a pension, and took over the Massachusetts Supreme Court building in Springfield, thus preventing the Massachusetts government from foreclosing on any property. They stormed the new federal arsenal at Springfield, but were not successful in taking over the grounds. Fighting started to take place everywhere in the state as the rebellion grew. Luckily enough, the Massachusetts militia defeated the rebels and dispersed them, and ended the fighting. It was apparent the Articles of Confederation constrained the federal government's power to deal with domestic concerns as well as foreign policy concerns. The Paris Treaty, which had terminated the Revolution, made provision that American debts to British subjects would still have to be paid, and loyalists were still permitted to file suits in United States courts for the restoration of their seized property. As every state was responsible for the compliance of these terms, there were inconsistencies throughout the nation, since some complied with these terms better than others. The effect was that British troops remained in the forts and land which now technically belonged to the United States, since the terms of the treaty had not been fulfilled. Having no powers to arbitrate or compel the states to comply with the treaty, the federal government was powerless. Having little choice, a convention was convened by a number of states in an attempt to amend the Articles. It was in May 1787 that the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia and commenced discussing the Articles of Confederation and what would have to change them. It was apparent at once that the Articles didn't function, but what government would. A new design from the ground up was suggested and fiercely argued about. As would become characteristic of American politics, some compromises were reached to obtain the equilibrium the states needed to ratify this new government. This new constitution would create a system of checks and balances with 3 separate branches, splitting the federal power among them. The legislative branch, or Congress, would consist of 2 houses, the House of Representatives, made up of state representatives similar in size to the population of each state, and the Senate, made up of 2 representatives from each state. It has the authority to enact and vote on legislation, impose taxes, declare war, override presidential vetoes, establish federal courts, except for the Supreme Court, and determine the number of Supreme Court justices. Apart from this, the Senate can confirm presidential appointments to the court, department heads, and other offices at the federal level, ratify treaties with foreign nations, and remove impeached officials. The federal officials, including the president, can be impeached by the House of Representatives. The executive would be headed by an elected president by an electoral college who would have the authority to execute, enforce, or veto federal laws, appoint federal officers, provide pardons, and serve as the chief role in any foreign policy matters. As commander-in-chief, it would also be the president's duty to command the military forces of the United States at the discretion of Congress. The third branch, the judicial branch, would be made up of a Supreme Court, which would be appointed by the President and ratified by the Congress. The Supreme Court is also accountable for interpreting Congress's passed laws and serving as the last decision on issues of legality. In a subsequent Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, 1803, the Supreme Court also added deciding which of Congress's laws is unconstitutional. Though this check was not part of the original Constitution, it is a key component of the court's function, a government for and by the people. It was the first time in which a nation's constitution mentioned the people as instrumental in the formation and legality of the government. The Constitution was written in September 1787 and sent to the Congress of the Confederation. Rather than the article amendments they had anticipated, the Constitution presented an entirely different type of government. There was immediate debate as the Constitution must be ratified, but not by consent of every state as with the Articles of Confederation, but by a 2/3 vote instead. In October 1787, the first of 85 pamphlets in support of the Constitution appeared and were widely circulated. Billed as the Federalist Papers, they were written anonymously in their time, though now we know they were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Two groups began to emerge quickly. There were the Federalists, who favored the Constitution and a strong central government, and there were the Anti-Federalists, who considered the Constitution to be too strong and taking away from the strength of state governments. State by state, though, the states ratified the Constitution. The requirement for a government change had reached a point of no return, and most of them understood that this Constitution would be the ideal option. The Constitution was formally ratified by the states during 1787 to 88, and on the 21st of June 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, also voted in favor, thereby making the Constitution the law of the land. American Revolution hero George Washington was chosen in early 1789 as the first president of the United States. John Adams, who got the second highest number of votes, was elected his vice president. Though Washington did not join either the Federalist or Anti-Federalist parties that had germinated, he did support Federalist policies in order to make the new government more powerful. He wisely appointed to his cabinet the most able political thinkers of the day, from Federalist and Anti-Federalist ranks, such as Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. Throughout his presidency, Washington tried to concentrate on the many domestic problems confronting the nation. He forced the Congress to enact tariffs on foreign imports in an attempt to collect revenue for the federal government, and collaborated closely with his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in getting passed a series of economic bills and programs which would establish a national bank and create a national debt for the government. He chose the permanent site for the future capital of the United States, to be named Washington, District of Columbia, in honor of the first president. Washington interpreted his role as commander-in-chief, literally during times of crisis. In 1790, to protest the Distilled Spirits Duties Act, or Whiskey Act, that taxed spirits distilled within the country, farmers in western Pennsylvania started an armed uprising. They assailed tax collectors and confronted federal troops, causing Washington to call out the Pennsylvania and Virginia militias to active service. He led the army himself into western Pennsylvania, and after a modest display of power, his commissioners succeeded in negotiating the termination of what was later called the Whiskey Rebellion. In foreign relations, Washington was beset on all sides by attacks. In France, their former friend King Louis XVI had lost power over his government and his people, and was witnessing a steadily worsening revolution. A source of trouble with Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, had the potential to interfere with a precarious American sea trade. England had started impressment, or the robbery of sailors and ships from other countries, so that Washington was forced to seek satisfaction. In sending his political friend and confidant John Jay to England, Washington hoped to negotiate a friendly trade accord and an end to American impressment. Jay came back with a treaty in his pocket and spoke well for the American government in Washington's opinion, bringing Great Britain and the United States closer to each other. The Jay Treaty irritated pro-French elements within his administration and throughout the nation. On the other hand, Washington was re-elected in 1792 for a second term with Adams again as his vice president. He continued to have problems with the new French Republic, as in 1793 they killed King Louis XVI and were swept through a series of revolutionary wars. Washington leaned heavily toward his preference for American independence from Europe, much to the annoyance of the pro-French members of his cabinet, such as Thomas Jefferson. In 1793, in his second term, Washington had to distance himself and the government from their provisional capital at Philadelphia because of an epidemic of yellow fever. The government relocated to Trenton, New Jersey, where the Continental Congress had briefly convened some years before in 1784. Washington grappled with the widening fissure in his administration. The anti-federalists, now the Democratic Republicans, had continued to move progressively farther ideologically from the Federalists. Washington was concerned with having two political parties and cautioned repeatedly that their presence had the potential to result in a severe breakup within the government. The Washington administration established a lot of precedents for the United States government and the office of the president. From prodding domestic policies to foreign intervention or inaction, Washington established the tone for his successors. Stepping down was his last move as president. Although Congress had not yet imposed any term limits on the president's office, it was generally thought that Washington could quite possibly continue as president, or even create a sort of dynasty, much like a king. Instead, after 2 terms in office, Washington resigned and did not seek office for a third term. His replacement, narrowly elected in 1797, was John Adams, whose own foreign affairs difficulties were as bad or worse than those of Washington. Conditions in France further deteriorated into an era referred to as the Reign of Terror. Adams perpetuated Washington's policy of avoiding France and pushed the United States increasingly away from it. The new French revolutionary government retaliated by launching an unofficial war against the United States, or quasi-war. The conflict was maintained largely at sea, and included a series of naval battles with America's new navy. Domestic, Adams grew progressively unpopular among the Democratic Republicans, as he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, permitting the government to arrest or silence anyone who was critical of the Adams administration's policy towards France. Bedeviled by his own party members and opposition members, Adams set out to negotiate an agreement with France and close his administration on a peaceful note. During his last year in office, Adams and his wife Abigail were the first presidential couple to reside at the White House in the new Washington, D.C. Capitol. They operated and exercised out of the building as it was constructed around them. Adams ran once more, with his peace with France, hopefully again in vogue, but fell to Thomas Jefferson in the early stages of the electoral process. The Thomas Jefferson presidency brought 25 years of Democratic-Republican domination of the executive office. Jefferson's administration moved quickly to reverse the damage they believed Washington and Adams' administrations had caused. Jefferson tried to decrease the built-up debt, decreasing the budget as low as he could. He cut back the Army and Navy and abolished the whiskey tax which had troubled Washington's presidency. Similar to Washington and Adams, Jefferson also had to deal with piracy in the Mediterranean. He used an American naval squadron to thoroughly defeat the Barbary pirates and compelled them to surrender. In contrast to his predecessors, Jefferson warmly cooperated with the new French regime, now in the hands of Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte wanted to realize fast money and to dispose of some outdated colonial possessions, so he sold the Louisiana Territory to Jefferson's government in 1803, opening the whole new frontier for Americans. In the following year, Jefferson used the Corps of Discovery under Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to undertake an expedition up the Missouri River and across the Continental Divide. Their mission was to chart the new region, to identify a viable route across the western portion of the continent, and to provide an American presence in the West before Europeans had a chance to stake out territory. With the help of a Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, who was an interpreter, the party encountered more than 70 Indian tribes, drew 140 maps, and recorded more than 200 new plant and animal species. Jefferson's second term was also disrupted by the Napoleonic Wars going on in Europe. The British and French navies now openly attacked American ships and mariners, leading to infringements of America's neutral rights of shipping. To counteract this, Jefferson used an embargo on shipping from America. It was extremely unpopular, and even more extremely unsuccessful, and hurt Jefferson's efforts to get the budget in balance before his second term expired. Although unpopular, the Democratic Republicans were at the end of Jefferson's administration. His protege James Madison was elected as the fourth President of the United States. Madison, who played a key role during the Constitutional Convention, inherited a complex and messy relationship with England and France, as well as growing tension in the United States. Madison carried on Jefferson's embargo during the first 2 years of his administration, recognizing that commerce was needed for the improvement of the United States, and on the instructions of Congress, Madison reopened American trade to France and England, requesting them once more to respect America's neutrality. Of course, taking of ships and impressment of Marines resumed almost at once. A cluster of young congressmen, two gentlemen by the name of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, pestered the president for a firmer display of force. Often referred to as war hawks, Clay, Calhoun, and their group insisted that Madison become more aggressive against Britain and France. Greater tensions on the interior of America fueled the fire. British agents were suspected of equipping and furnishing a native rebellion along the frontier, and British forces still occupied forts that were part of the United States. When British vessels openly assaulted American mariners just off the coast of America, Madison capitulated to the war hawks and requested the Congress to declare war on June 1, 1812. The people of America were perhaps prepared to fight Britain, but its navy and army were not. In 3 successive invasions of Canada, the United States was defeated and repelled, with 2 of the 3 armies compelled to capitulate. While not lacking entirely in success, one of the invasions had resulted in the destruction of the city of York, the provincial capital in Canada. Naval engagements were much more successful. In one example, the USS Constitution and the HMS Guerriere clashed in a brief naval battle, which did not last more than an hour. The British were appalled to discover that their cannonballs ricocheted harmlessly off of the 22-inch hull of the Constitution. The USS Constitution would proceed. Unlike past presidents, he used the Sherman Antitrust Act to dissolve monopolies, such as the railroad belonging to J.P. Morgan. The firm Northern Securities dominated nearly all railroad shipping in the northern U.S., and in 1902, Roosevelt took the issue to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Roosevelt. And while the previous president, Grover Cleveland, had dispatched federal soldiers to suppress a railroad strike in the 1880s, when Roosevelt confronted a massive coal miner strike in 1902, he deployed agents to act as a neutral mediator. Roosevelt won re-election handily in 1904, running on his square deal platform of trust busting, preserving natural resources, and defending the consumer. Like in the Gilded Age, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were continuing to arrive in the U.S. in large numbers during the Progressive Age. Between 1900 and the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914, more than 13 million immigrants arrived. This meant the issues of slums and tenements that were so prevalent during the Gilded Age were only growing. The progressives, who were primarily middle-class white social reformers, viewed the urban poor as a social issue. Reformers Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr opened Hull House in Chicago in 1889, one of the earliest social settlements in North America. It offered social services such as early child education and adult education to poor immigrants. Progressive activists all had particular things that they perceived as more pressing to reform, so reform movements tended to be a mosaic of initiatives that cut across a broad range of social maladies. Some progressive reformers wished to extend the reach of government to curb the undesirable features of capitalism. Businesses were no longer able to run wild, unregulated with the emergence of state factory inspectors and public health bureaus, who were charged with reducing hazardous working conditions, preventing poisonous food from being sold and suppressing contagious diseases. One of the incidents that spurred more corporate regulation was the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 in Boston, when a tank holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst and swept a wave of the syrupy molasses down the city streets. The wave was reported to travel at a maximum of 35 miles per hour and reach a height of up to 25 feet. 21 individuals lost their lives, and over 150 were injured, and a several-block area was inundated with water up to 2 to 3 feet in depth. The tank was employed by the Purity Distilling Company for the storage of molasses before it was transported by pipeline to be fermented for producing ethanol, a key ingredient in alcohol and an important ingredient in munitions. While the company attributed the tank's destruction to anarchists, a class action lawsuit on behalf of the victims was filed, and a court-appointed auditor determined the company was at fault. It was the first class action lawsuit in Massachusetts and made cash awards to the families of the victims. Progressive reformers sought to clean up big business and the government in a variety of ways, including through the adoption of more amendments to the Constitution. The 16th Amendment, which legalized graduating the income tax from one's income, was added in 1909, and the 17th Amendment tried to make elections more equitable by establishing the direct election of senators instead of by state legislatures, potentially controlled by political bosses in 1913. Other political reforms believed to provide the citizenry with a greater direct influence over their governments by implementing the initiative and the referendum, allowing citizens to place proposed legislation on a ballot without the support of their legislators. Reformers also aimed to simplify government through the short ballot, meant to enhance the accountability and transparency of government and clarity and public utility commissions, aimed to stabilize city gas and water prices and streetcar fares and railroad shipping charges, while zoning boards and city planning commissions aimed to beautify slums, improve contaminated water supplies, and organize disorderly land markets. Other reformers targeted the prevention of the venereal disease epidemics, the suppression of prostitution, and other actions for the public health and morals. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, spearheaded campaigns to advocate temperance, or the avoidance of alcohol, and the discouragement of premarital sex. Temperance and prohibition were issues embraced by many progressive reformers who regarded alcohol as an evil that gave rise to numerous other problems such as domestic violence and poverty. These activists, branded as the Drees, facilitated the stage for several states to enact bills prohibiting the sale, possession, or shipment of alcohol. In 1907, Georgia and Alabama became the first of the states to go dry, followed by Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By 1917, 2/3 of the states had some type of prohibition laws, and about 3/4 of the population resided in dry regions. With the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which inaugurated prohibition of alcohol in the U.S., this patchwork received federal backing. Middle-class white individuals did not undertake all reform initiatives. The progressive era also witnessed black communities in the South segregated society, adopting reform projects such as bettering schools, demanding greater portions of state budgets, taking legal action to achieve equal rights, and environmental causes. Meanwhile, though, the nation was immersed in a time period known as the nadir of race relations, which created some of the worst racial violence and racist policies ever. During this time, African Americans lost access to many of the rights improvements they had gained during the Reconstruction period. Violence, lynchings, segregation, and legalized racial discrimination all proliferated. In reaction, African Americans began increasingly to move north in a period known as the Great Migration. Many of those who migrated moved to northern cities such as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. They continued to encounter extreme hostility, along with segregation and rampant racism. In the West and Midwest, sundown towns were many where the African Americans were assured that they would be assaulted should they stay beyond sundown. When President Woodrow Wilson was elected into office in 1912, he engaged in fresh attempts to segregate the federal government's buildings. The 1915 film Birth of a Nation glorified the original Ku Klux Klan and is said to have returned the Klan to power in the 1920s, more power actually than it had ever enjoyed previously. By 1924, The clan boasted 4 million members and considerable sway over the governments of numerous southern and western states. Mob violence against African Americans was rampant. 36 American cities experienced white supremacist violence during the summer of 1919, hence the Red Summer. White mobs killed a minimum of 43 black men during that year, but a report presented to President Wilson suggested that the states did not want to do anything about prosecuting the murders. Most of the returned black soldiers who had served overseas during World War I were frustrated and outraged by such conditions after having struggled for their nation. From the perspective of progressive reform, numerous individuals felt that race relations issues truly were based on a society being integrated, and reformers struggled for greater segregation. From 1895 to 1910, Southern state progressives contributed to black citizens being denied the vote by making popular the Grandfather Clause, which limited voting privileges to men admitted to voting, or whose male family members were admitted to voting prior to 1867. This disenfranchised black voters since the 15th Amendment, granting them a right to vote, wasn't enacted until 1870. In 1915, the Supreme Court ruled the Grandfather Clause unconstitutional, but it continued to be used. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the 15th Amendment was enforceable. While black voting was being driven out, voting power for white females was coming in. Groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union fought women's suffrage, while also fighting issues such as prohibition. Aside from sexist thinking then, others objected to female suffrage because they did not want the women's vote to influence issues they disagreed with, like abolishing child labor and banning alcohol, and add to the voting base's proportion of socialists. Alice Paul created the National Women's Party in 1916, which worked towards securing women the vote at the national level. When the US went into World War I in 1917 to fill the places left by men who had gone to war, women entered the jobs that were long closed to them. The 19th Amendment, which banned discrimination at the polls on the grounds of sex, was ratified on August 18, 1920. The US aspired to be a world leader in other fields. The search for an explorer to find the North Pole, the last uncharted region of the Northern Hemisphere, stimulated rivalry among British, Norwegian, and American expeditions. Many expeditions were attempted. In 1909, the New York Times reported that explorer and retired U.S. Navy Commander Robert Peary had become the first to arrive at the North Pole, but his triumph was tainted by another U.S.-American explorer, Frederick Cook, who said he had been to the pole 1 year earlier. The rival claims roused much controversy, with individuals not knowing whom to believe with the victory. Newspapers surveyed their readers as to who they believed had been the winner. Peary testified before a subcommittee of the House of Representatives in January 1911 to justify his claim, and the subcommittee voted narrowly in favor of awarding recognition for the achievement to Peary. The Bill of Recognition, signed into law by President William Howard Taft, however, failed to give credit to Peary for having discovered the North Pole, but instead, in a more general sense, praised him for his work in exploring the Arctic. Today's question is still whether or not Cook or Peary ever reached the pole. In 1904, the U.S. assumed efforts by the French to construct a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, across a 50-mile length of Panama. The notion of a Panama Canal went as far back as the first explorers of the Americas, who recognized that it would be a convenient shortcut between Europe and Eastern Asia. Under presidential guidance from Roosevelt, the U.S. battled mosquito-borne diseases, relentlessly dug through the surrounding mountain range, and developed a locks and dam system by which boats would be transported across varying water levels. The canal was opened on August 15, 1914, and was then the most costly endeavor in U.S. history, to cost the U.S. government a total of approximately $375 million at the time. It is also accompanied by a cost in human lives. Hundreds of thousands of people died in its construction, although accurate records were not kept. A minimum of 5,600 workers were recorded killed between 1904 and 1913, but this is believed to be a considerable underestimate. The Panama Canal construction was a vital stimulus to world trade routes for the 20th century. It would eventually be known as being among the wonders of the modern world. It was one of the most prominent technological accomplishments of the progressive era. As European nations sided in the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson announced that the United States was going to stay neutral in what was then referred to as the Great War, after a German submarine torpedoed the British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, killing more than 1,000 people, of which 128 were Americans. Public sentiment towards U.S. involvement shifted. In 1917, the British intercepted a coded telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico, suggesting that the nations form an alliance to reclaim Mexican land if the U.S. entered the war on the Allies' side. Outrage from the public against this proposal, as well as against the continuous German submarine attacks on unarmed ships, prompted Wilson to call upon Congress to declare war against Germany. Congress concurred on the 6th of April 1917, and eventually authorized the Selective Service Act, which imposed the first peacetime draft since the Civil War, drafting approximately 2.8 million men, in addition to another 2 million men who enlisted voluntarily. German Americans had to register with the government, and thousands of them were arrested and questioned. There were some that were interned throughout the war, in 2 camps for prisoners of war, which were in Georgia and Utah. The home front initially was not that well prepared to assist the war effort. The whole economy and entire U.S. population had to assist in keeping the money, soldiers, food, supplies and ammunition moving. The federal government established numerous new agencies to assist the economy in its shift to serve the war effort and to generate propaganda. 1 week after issuing a declaration of war against Germany, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, an agency devoted to producing pro-war propaganda, employing photographs, films, rallies, scripted speeches, press accounts and public meetings. The CPI promoted American patriotism and incited anti-German feelings. With the enactment of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, criticism of the war effort or government was in effect illegal. Children and youth organizations, in particular, were targeted to instill patriotism and to assist in bringing about support for the war. The U.S. Food Administration told American citizens to stint on their food budgets and plant so-called victory gardens in their backyards to feed their families. A constitutional amendment levied an income tax on high-income earners, and businesses were subjected to other new taxes on their war profits, which all contributed to paying for the war. The majority of new money, however, came from the sale of war bonds. Numerous women started working in traditionally masculine jobs to aid the war effort, like on assembly lines producing munitions. Some worked for the military as support staff or nurses at home and abroad. The Army Signal Corps hired female switchboard operators to assist communication along the Western Front. They were well trained and could speak both English and French. But since the War Department prohibited women except as hospital nurses, they were employed reluctantly only. In the end, women were taken in for the purpose of releasing more men into the front. American men who crossed over to fight in France were warmly welcomed by the depleted Allied soldiers. The initial components of the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, began to arrive in France during the month of June 1917. U.S. troops were coming at a rate of 10,000 per day by early 1918, and thus exerted a profound effect on the ability of the Ally to repel the Germans' strong spring offensive. While American leaders at first were employing faulty tactics that others had long since discarded, producing attacks with large numbers of casualties, the introduction of U.S. troops helped the Allies' strategic situation and boosted morale. Under the 100 Days Offensive of the Allies in 1918, the American troops initiated the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. For 47 days, 1.2 million U.S. soldiers pushed the Germans back 40 miles. Over 26,000 American soldiers were killed. The 100 Days Offensive contributed to the Allies' victory, and the war was officially deemed won on November 11, 1918. All in all, within fewer than 6 months of combat, approximately 53,402 Americans died in battle, and another 63,114 died from accidents and disease. The U.S. quickly dissolved wartime contracts and brought soldiers home, but the U.S. of the time did not have programs to assist veterans in adjusting to civilian life. In January 1919, the U.S. joined the other Allies in Paris to seek peace. President Wilson had a list of 14 points, some of which found their way into the final document, such as the formation of a League of Nations, the first international intergovernmental organization committed to ensuring peace in the world. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June 1919, but the US never ratified the treaty and rather negotiated a separate peace treaty with Germany. Wilson, a Democrat, had declined to invite any prominent Republicans to the peace negotiations, as he intended to achieve peace without victory. Republicans dominated the Senate following the election of 1918 and were furious that Wilson would not negotiate the war, since they desired the unconditional surrender of Germany. Since the senators were split, Democratic allies of Wilson against the irreconcilables or the Republicans, and certain Democrats opposing the treaty, it was impossible to secure the necessary two-thirds majority to pass. The Democrats who were against the treaty spoke for those of the American people, primarily Irish Catholics and German Americans who were strongly against the treaty because they believed it was pro-British. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted down a peace treaty for the first time in its history. Under Wilson's replacement, Warren G. Harding, the US-German peace treaty was signed August 25, 1921. The treaty permitted American-German cooperation not subject to the League of Nations. Following the First World War, the US experienced a period of post-war recuperation. The economy soared, building exploded, and consumer items such as cars and electricity became much more available. The decade was one of daring innovation and experimentation, along with strong resistance to these phenomena from individuals who did not approve of the way the country's culture appeared to be headed. This chaotic period was referred to as the Roaring Twenties. For the first time in history, during the 1920s, the majority of Americans, 51%, resided in urban areas rather than villages or farms. New standards, the result of decades-long trends, altered urban life, especially that of women. In the beginning of the decade, between 1/4 and 1/3 of single urban women workers resided alone in private flats or boarding houses instead of at home with their parents, in accordance with old Victorian morals. These new women went to public entertainment such as dancing halls, amusement parks and cinema theaters, which attracted youngsters out on dates, a formation that was substituting the traditional courting culture. They had time for these things now. As manufacturing and stores became mechanized, the city blue-collar worker was working fewer hours. The typical work week decreased from 55.9 hours in 1900 to 44.2. In 1929, blue-collar wages increased 25%. Yet several Americans were having leftover money to spend during the 1920s, because incomes were increasing and credit was readily available, and it was becoming more socially acceptable to spend money on consumer products and take on debt on such products, even if they were not outright necessities. The country's overall wealth doubled more than twice. Between 1920 and 1929, individuals purchased tickets to the cinema to watch such stars as Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. By the mid-1920s, cinema houses were selling 50 million tickets weekly, an amount equivalent to approximately half the population of the US. They purchased ready-to-wear clothing, which was being mass-produced, and hence became cheaper. They purchased radios. In the very first live radio broadcast to the public, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania radio station, KDKA, carried the presidential election returns on November 2, 1920. There were radios in over 12 million homes by the end of the 1920s. In 1912, it was estimated that 16% of American homes had electricity. By the mid-1920s, over 60% did. Appliances that consumed electricity, such as the washing machine, the freezer, and the vacuum cleaner, were items of choice, and individuals purchased automobiles, which were a luxury within their reach. The Ford Model T was priced at $260 in 1924, which is equivalent to approximately $4,000 today. But while some individuals were enjoying prosperity and wealth, others barely made ends meet. Wide wealth disparity, which had vexed the progressives and characterized the Gilded Age, continued. The top 0.1% of families earned as much as the bottom 42% earned in the 20s, and more than 40% of Americans eked out a living on less than $1,500 annually, or the poverty level at that time. The majority of individuals who resided outside of metropolitan areas did not benefit from prosperity during the Roaring Twenties. Farm prices bottomed out during the years following World War I. People were able to afford automobiles with the mass production of cars, and so they could go wherever they pleased. Many of the youth of the time wanted to go out and dance at jazz clubs. Jazz music came north with black artists who traveled from New Orleans where the style was born. Chicago emerged as the new hub of the art form, with the city having over 100 jazz clubs. Whites and blacks first started socializing together in the Black and Tan clubs of Chicago. Poet Langston Hughes wrote that midnight was like day, describing the city's nightlife as full of music. Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Ethel Waters, among other musicians, attracted audiences to dance halls, and individuals danced in innovative African-American-styled ways. Charleston, cakewalk, turkey trot, and flea hop were all fashionable dances of the era. Some of the larger dance clubs then were the Cotton Club in Harlem, New York, where Duke Ellington's orchestra performed, and the Grand Terrace Cafe in Chicago, where Earl Hines' orchestra performed. Then the focal point of jazz music shifted to New York City, where Harlem Renaissance was on its peak. But due to the fact that jazz music was started by African Americans and was a deviation from traditionally white music, much backlash grew in response to jazz's growing popularity. Individuals pronounced for the purported moral tragedies it bequeathed, its origins in black culture, and some called it devil's music. By the late 1920s, there were at least 60 communities in the country where jazz was prohibited from being performed in public dance halls. Radio broadcasts brought jazz melodies to listeners throughout the country, and 100 million jazz phonograph records were sold during 1927 alone. But due to racism and discrimination, they were mostly of white bands imitating the black musicians who created the genre. Thomas Edison, the founder of the phonograph, mocked jazz music by stating that it sounded better in reverse, and Shaw Faulkner, leader of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, a strong coalition of women, social, and reform organizations that began its anti-jazz crusade in 1921, once remarked that jazz was once the voodoo dance accompaniment, exciting half-crazed savages to the most depraved acts. The growing prominence of black culture and jazz and blues music, and the arrival of millions of African Americans who migrated north in the Great Migration, brought about enormous racist backlash. Millions of Americans enrolled in the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, expanding the group's ranks to 5 million by 1925. The organization controlled the governments of Indiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado by mid-decade, and was hugely influential in a number of other states, including California and Georgia. The conservative fundamentalist paramilitary organization began white supremacist terrorism, and also attacked Jews, Catholics, Asians, and the so-called New Women. One of the most terrible examples of violence was the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, when a mob set fire to the Black Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and killed dozens. The KKK remained only more powerful in Oklahoma after the event. Generally, the 20s were years typified by nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. A Red Scare in which individuals sought to hunt, expose, and prosecute communists took place from 1919 to 1920, and the Klan-sponsored National Origins Act of 1924 strictly limited immigration from Eastern Europe and Asia, while placing a preference on immigrants from Northern Europe and Great Britain. The federal prohibition of liquor in 1920, which forbade the production and sale of alcoholic drinks across the country, was motivated as much by reformers who wanted to heal America's ills of poverty and violence, as it was by those opposed to the increasing number of urban residing immigrants in the U.S. Anti-German sentiment following World War I gave rise to the nickname Kaiser Brew for the beer produced in German breweries. Beer, wine, whiskey, and gin were all prohibited by the law, but it was almost impossible for the government to enforce. Bootlegging and smuggling were common, and speakeasies, or clandestine clubs which sold illegal liquor, became prevalent in urban areas. During 1927, an estimated 30,000 illegal speakeasies existed, double the amount of legal establishments prior to Prohibition. Federal authorities raided these businesses, searching for violators, but the cases were difficult to prosecute. In New York, 7,000 arrests for alcohol law violations yielded 17 convictions. Black markets for alcohol that operated a profitable and violent business were operated by organized crimes like mafia gangs and groups, which thrived as consumer demand was not met through legitimate channels. These groups ran their operations partly through paying off police officers and federal agents. Al Capone's Chicago outfit allegedly collected $60 million in 1927 and employed half of the city's police. John D. Rockefeller, a non-drinker, noted in 1932 that due to prohibition, alcohol has actually increased on the whole, the speakeasy supplanted the saloon, and an enormous army of violators has been enlisted and subsidized on a gigantic scale. Although that may have been the case anecdotally, other accounts indicate that overall, drinking actually declined during Prohibition. Based on statistics, alcohol-related deaths due to cirrhosis of the liver in men declined between 1911 and 1929. Additionally, it has been discovered that levels of alcohol consumption did not return to their pre-Prohibition highs until the 1960s. All good things must come to an end. Reduced consumer demand. There's only so many cars and radios you can buy, and increasing consumer debt paired with over-optimism in purchasing stocks meant stock was severely overvalued. On what would become Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed, launching the worst economic slump in American history. The Great Depression, ending the overconsumptive, freewheeling Roaring Twenties. Millions of shares in stocks proved to be valueless and consumer confidence disappeared. The subsequent reduction in consumer consumption led factories to reduce production, laying off employees. 4 million Americans who were job-seeking by 1930 and 6 million by 1931 could not find work. Most Americans with debt could not repay, and had their houses repossessed. Being homeless became widespread. The Empire State Building, which would be the initial building in the world to contain over 100 floors, had begun construction only a few weeks earlier than the stock market collapse. Several tall structures were being designed and built during the late 1920s, an aspect of optimism characteristic of the times. This race to the heavens involved 5 other planned buildings, but only the Empire State Building would survive as a result of the 1929 crash. The building took a record-setting 1 year and 45 days to complete. However, due to the Great Depression, there was hardly any need for office space, and the building remained largely vacant until the 1940s. Aside from the economic hardship, there was also a severe drought in 1930 that moved from Texas to Nebraska, accompanied by strong winds and dust that caused the death of people, livestock and crops. This event came to be referred to as the Dust Bowl, and it encouraged even more individuals to move from the plains to the cities to find employment. Between 1930 and 1933, the economic crisis just kept worsening as thousands of banks had to shut down. President Herbert Hoover attempted to support the ailing banks, but Hoover was a Republican who did not think the government should intervene in the economy directly or give economic aid. During 1932, with nearly 15 million unemployed across the country, citizens voted overwhelmingly for Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, who acted at once. In his first 100 days, the Roosevelt administration legislated bank reform and reopening, stabilization of industrial and agricultural production, and job creation. Unemployment stood at 20% in 1935, so through executive order, Roosevelt established a permanent jobs program to be known as the Works Progress Administration. Between 1935 and 1943, the WPA worked for 8.5 million individuals, constructing schools, hospitals, roads, and other public facilities, as well as on arts programs, hiring tens of thousands of actors, musicians, writers, and other artists. The WPA had a peak of over 3.3 million Americans working for the organization in late 1938. They constructed over 4,000 new school facilities, constructed 130 new hospitals, installed approximately 9,000 miles of storm sewers and sewer mains, constructed 29,000 new bridges, constructed 150 new airfields, paved or resurfaced 280,000 miles of roadway, and planted 24 million trees to help mitigate loss of topsoil during the Dust Bowl. Some of the best-known projects constructed by the WPA include the Hoover Dam across the Colorado River, New York City's Lincoln Tunnel, the LaGuardia Airport in Queens, and the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, famously red. Funds from New Deal also went toward the construction of Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. U.S. presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln into the face of the mountain were sculpted by a team of some 400 artists. blacksmiths forged tools and tramway workers transported people and gear to and from the base of the isolated mountain. The cost of the project was almost $1 million, nearly 85% of which was derived from federal funds. UDPA was condemned for the slow pace of the project and inefficiencies, yet it was hailed for the jobs that it provided millions of Americans stricken by the Depression. Other significant New Deal initiatives were the establishment of the Social Security Administration to safeguard older Americans economically, the Agriculture Adjustment Act to assist farmers in paying off debts, and the U.S. Housing Authority was established to deal with homelessness. The National Labor Relations Act was enacted in 1935 to safeguard labor organizing, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established maximum hours and minimum pay for most employees. However, not everyone was a supporter of Roosevelt's reforms, with conservative critics referring to them as government interference. Following the 1938 elections, New Deal measures were harder to pass since the new Congress was less liberal and less favorably disposed to spending. The election of the new conservative members of the Congress was primarily caused by a decline in public opinion towards the Roosevelt administration during the economic recession of 1937 to 1938. Since Roosevelt had taken credit for the past economic gains, the people blamed him for the setback. However, the popularity of the New Deal assisted the Democratic Party in remaining the dominant party in national politics through the 1960s. When the Second World War broke out in Europe in the fall of 1939, the overwhelming majority of Americans were isolationists. President Roosevelt saw, however, that it was crucial to see that Britain and France were given every opportunity to win the war. When France fell entirely in June 1940, Roosevelt started a Lend-Lease operation with the British, shipping war equipment and humanitarian aid on American vessels. On the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese fleet finally arrived and attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack heavily damaged the fleet, sinking 3 of its battleships and damaging a few other ships. Nonetheless, the Japanese failed to destroy American aircraft carriers. The attack was a shock and horror to Americans. Japan had anticipated the attack would disable the American Pacific Fleet and enable them to quickly dominate the Pacific theater. Rather, the Americans rebounded with nearly superhuman speed and in less than 6 months delivered a crippling blow against the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. The U.S. win at Midway made the Pacific available to the U.S. fleet and permitted U.S. ground troops to be escorted safely to Japanese-held islands. In Europe, after the general declaration of war on Japan following Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler, the Nazi German leader, declared war on the U.S. in support of his Axis ally. The United States, having joined the Allied powers, was keen to assist Britain in recapturing the European theater. The War Department prepared a series of military campaigns to reconquer North Africa and Europe from fascist powers, while at the same time preparing for an extended invasion of the scores of islands in the Pacific to assist Australia and the Philippines against Japan. The United States was once more at war and now battling enemies on 2 distinct fronts on a worldwide level. The entire nation mobilized, with men numbering in the millions joining to fight, and the millions remaining on the home front, readjusting to help manufacture war supplies and other products in order to aid the war effort. Unfortunately, the xenophobia and fear of Asian Americans instilled by the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor resulted in Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, which mandated that any and all citizens deemed to be a threat to national security in the country be interned. With so much of the west coast of the United States partitioned into military districts for the prosecution of a foreign war, in excess of 120,000 Japanese Americans, over 2/3 of whom were native-born, were taken from their homes and relocated to camps further inland and away from U.S. military operations on the west coast. Roosevelt's administration and the Army High Command immediately understood that it was crucial to free Europe as quickly as possible. The victory over the Japanese Navy at Midway early in the war provided the U.S. forces with an opportunity to re-strategize their operations in the Pacific while planning for operations in Europe. After some controversy, North Africa was designated as the initial landing point for U.S. forces to start the liberation of the Allies in Europe. During autumn 1942, the Allies waged Operation Torch to deliver a sharp, swift blow against the Axis-held North African shore. The attack was a gigantic multinational campaign between the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Canada, the Netherlands, Free France, and Australian troops. During a week of fighting, the Allied powers had gained possession of the principal ports along the African coast and had captured much of Morocco and Algiers. Operation Torch was the beginning of an Allied advance, which would progressively gain control over all of North Africa and proceed to Italy by autumn of 1943. In the Pacific, American forces engaged in what had been called an island hopping or leapfrogging operation. Through the power and pacesetters of the U.S. Navy, the Americans could deploy U.S. Marines and military forces on the hundreds of Japanese-held islands in the South Pacific rapidly. The plan served them well, keeping the Japanese troops constantly on the brink of attack and gradually strangling their capacity to reinforce and supply critical islands. The Japanese were frequently compelled to take cover and fight for every inch of terrain without any expectation of relief or evacuation. During the period of 2 years, starting in the autumn of 1942, the U.S. military engaged in ferocious campaigns in Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and several more. In Europe, with the collapse of Italy, the U.S. and the Allies shifted their gaze to freeing France from German occupation. In the opposite part of the European continent, the German invasion of their home country was repelled at last by the Soviet Union, and were progressively driving the Nazis back towards Germany. Taking advantage of this, American and British planners laid out an aggressive amphibious strike on the Normandy beaches of France's north. At the behest of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied forces mounted Operation Neptune, better recognized as D-Day, on June 6, 1944. Similar to Operation Torch in North Africa, D-Day was a multinational invasion, and involved the majority of Allied powers, with American, British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces making major contributions. Without doubt one of the most famous moments of the Second World War, D-Day was the high point of Allied unity and the start of the end for Hitler's Germany and the Axis powers. It was not long before the German occupation of France fell apart under the pressure of the Allied liberation after D-Day. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had driven the Nazi soldiers to the French-German border and set up for winter battles via the Ardennes forest. While the Soviets continued their merciless attack in the east, Hitler diverted precious military resources west in the hope of surprising the Allies. In December 1944, German troops made what would prove to be the last attack of the war via the Ardennes. The attack was initially successful, driving Allied units back. Luckily, Allied air superiority checked the Nazi advance and brought it to a grinding halt. By the time the offensive finally came to a close, the Germans had effectively almost surrounded a large U.S. pocket of troops and burrowed in for the winter. During what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, American troops were subjected to constant artillery fire, surprise attacks, and harsh weather, yet never surrendered. When German troops demanded the American soldiers surrender, their commanding officer supposedly responded with a single word: nuts. Spring arrived, and so did Allied air support, and Germans were rapidly driven off, and the pocket was relieved. Having spent all their resources, having their soldiers deserting in droves, and Allied forces closing in on both the east and west, Germany was finally on the verge of surrender. It would be a few months of intense combat before the Soviet forces arrived in Berlin. Hitler took his own life, and the pre-Nazi government of Germany came back into power as World War II in Europe finally came to a close. In the Pacific, island upon island dropped into the hands of the US advance. In the spring of 1945, the US was gearing up to invade the Japanese home islands, a prospect not welcomed by military or government. In April 1945, President Franklin D.T. Roosevelt suddenly died, passing the office on to his Vice President Harry Truman. Truman was immediately briefed on a top-secret program that had been testing the development of an atomic weapon known as the Manhattan Project. Under the leadership of physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the project had assembled foremost scientific minds from all over the United States and internationally to create an atomic weapon powerful enough to bring the war to a close. Upon becoming president, Truman inherited the choice to deploy the bomb, confronted with a Japanese government that was not willing to capitulate, and what would probably be an enormously expensive series of ground assaults. Truman authorized the use of the bombs as a means of preventing huge numbers of casualties. At 8:15 a.m. on the 6th of August, 1945, the United States dropped Little Boy, an enriched uranium bomb, on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. It detonated about a mile above the city with 15 kilotons of TNT power. The primary blast leveled everything inside a mile of where the bomb had detonated, except some earthquake-resistant buildings. The 1,200-foot, or 370-meter fireball, created by the blast emitted a blinding flash of light, and attained temperatures of 6,000 Celsius or 10,830 degrees Fahrenheit, equal to the surface of the sun. Those close to the center of the explosion were vaporized at once, with nothing remaining but their shadows upon the bleached white rock. The fireball was approximately 2 miles, or 3.2 kilometers in diameter, burning everything along its way. The destruction due to the bombing resulted in approximately 60% of the deaths, with the rest being due to injury incurred and to the radiation, which was diffused from the site of the explosion. Approximately 80,000 to 140,000 civilians and soldiers were killed due to the bombing. When news of the complete extent of the damage started to get around, the US government once more appealed to the Japanese to surrender, vowing to release another atomic bomb if they did not. Once again, the Japanese government declined, and another atomic bomb was released on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, was dropped at 11:01 a.m. on Nagasaki's Industrial Valley and detonated 47 seconds later at 11:02. Fat Man erupted with the energy of 21 kilotons of TNT, 40% more than Little Boy had. But as a result of weather, the bombardiers had released the bomb a greater distance from their target, with the result that a large amount of the explosion was deflected by the mountains surrounding the industrial area. Similar to Hiroshima's bombing, the explosion and following fireball engulfed everything inside the blast area and produced most of the casualties. Between 60,000 and 80,000 individuals were murdered by the bombing, with hundreds of thousands injured. All in all, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings claimed the lives of an estimated 129,000 to 226,000 people, the vast majority of whom were civilians. The Japanese government indicated their readiness to surrender on the condition that their government could be left in place on August 10th. The United States responded that the conditions would be negotiated once Japanese leaders officially surrendered. An attempted military coup on the night of August 14th was briefly undertaken by elements of the government who wanted to continue the fight to the end. It was suppressed at once by the Japanese government. The next day, the Japanese emperor gave an official surrender statement. The Second World War was finally over. Over 16 million men and women had served in the US Armed Forces during the war, and some 420,000 Americans had sacrificed their lives in an effort to liberate the free world. In so doing, the United States had put behind it its policy of isolation and moved into a new era of globalism. America was now a world power and had much of the responsibility for what the future held in its hands. While their wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had been one of need, relations had become strained even before the end of the war. Worse still, with the use of atomic weapons, America had inadvertently ushered in a new era of warfare and technology, one that would characterize the decades ahead. Regardless of having fought side by side against Nazi Germany during World War II, America and the Soviet Union were never as much as friendly. America was suspicious of the Soviet communist form of government as well as atrocities carried out by leader Joseph Stalin. While the Soviets were upset that the US didn't want them to become a leader in the world community. While these complaints were passionately believed, the war that became the Cold War never turned violent due to the danger of atomic bombs. The US followed a policy called containment, which dealt with preventing Russia's efforts to spread their influence and control all around the world. This policy gave the basis for unprecedented arms accumulation in the US. World War II had been brought to an end by atomic bombings of Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, showcasing the US's dominance with a new generation of weapons. In 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear weapon, heating up the competition. They were competing to create even stronger weapons, the hydrogen bomb. In late 1952, the US tested a hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands, which exploded hundreds of times more destructive than the bombs used in Japan. The Soviet Union also conducted its own test in Kazakhstan in 1955. The tests created catastrophic health consequences for those living close by in both places. However, the testing itself only increased in 1958, when the US, Soviets, and United Kingdom conducted over 100 bombs across the globe. Subsequently, the three nations voluntarily ceased testing. The Cold War impacted the life of Americans in numerous ways. Nuclear war fears prompted drills at schools and individuals to construct bomb shelters in their backyards. Perhaps most damagingly, communist sympathies were feared in the US and led the government to create the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, which was assigned to conduct investigations of suspected communists. Thousands of federal employees were questioned, many were dismissed, and a few even prosecuted. Liberal college professors were fired, compelled to testify against their colleagues, and others compelled to sign loyalty oaths. In Hollywood, hundreds of people were investigated, and more than 500 movie industry professionals lost their jobs for having liberal beliefs. Many of these blacklisted writers, directors, actors, and others were unable to work again for more than a decade. This period became known as the Red Scare, and is also referred to as McCarthyism, after Senator Joseph McCarthy, a vehemently anti-communist politician who led the efforts. Another symbol of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall, which was constructed in 1961 between East Germany and West Germany, the communist and capitalist halves of the city, respectively. While the communist regime maintained that it was to exclude the so-called Western fascists from entering East Germany, the wall actually served to block mass desertions from east to west. It was also a remedy for the Berlin crisis of 1958, when Khrushchev insisted that the Allies relinquish West Berlin, which they had occupied after the end of World War II in 1945. Relations between the Westerners and Soviet-supported Easterners remained strained even after the wall had been erected. Prosperity in West Berlin followed in sharp contrast to the destitution surrounding the adjacent East German land. The border between them soon became a symbol of the Cold War in Europe. The influence of the Cold War on everyday life was especially manifest in the almost two-week war that resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Americans believed that the world was on the threshold of a full-scale nuclear war. The nation's standoff came close to war in October 1962, when US spy aircraft detected covert Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, only 90 miles from US shores. A year before, in 1961, the US had launched the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in an attempt to overthrow Cuba's Soviet-friendly leader, Fidel Castro. Throughout the 13-day standoff, US President John F. Kennedy had a naval blockade of Cuba and openly declared the US was willing to resort to military force to neutralize the threat. But the crisis ended when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles in return for a promise: the US would not invade Cuba and uninstall missiles it had covertly installed in Turkey to threaten Russia. The incident served to sober the USSR as well as the US. A year later, a direct telephone link between Washington and Moscow was installed to assist in diffusing such incidents. The two nations, together with the United Kingdom, signed a 1963 treaty to prohibit a number of nuclear tests. The anti-communist nature of the Cold War directed the US into other foreign conflicts in its effort to aid democratic governments and overthrow communist ones. The North Korean People's Army, backed by the Soviets, invaded pro-Western South Korea in June 1950. Most US officials believed that this was the beginning of a communist drive to conquer the world, and that they had a responsibility in a battle of good versus evil to intervene. US President Harry Truman thus deployed troops into Korea, but fighting abated and deaths occurred in a standoff of border skirmishes. Almost 5 million individuals lost their lives, over half of them civilians, and thus a worse civilian casualty ratio than World War II or the subsequent Vietnam War. 40,000 Americans were killed in action, and 100,000 were wounded. After over 2 years of diplomacy, the enemy signed on July 27, 1953, an armistice, and when in 1954, the French colonial government in Vietnam was overthrown by communists, President Dwight D. Eisenhower invoked American intervention under the domino theory, which was the belief that if a communist government were to maintain control in one country, communist governments would control others closer to it, with each falling to communism, like a series of falling dominoes. But what was to be a short military intervention unraveled into a violent, unpopular, and losing 10-year war in Vietnam. Though remaining fiercely anti-communist, When he entered the White House in 1969, US President Richard Nixon promptly attempted to mollify US relations with the Soviet Union and roll back the Cold War through diplomacy. In 1972, the Soviet Union and the US signed an agreement to reduce the number of nuclear missiles within their own arsenals, but under President Ronald Reagan, the war raged higher, as he wished to give money and military assistance to the anti-communist fighters across the globe, especially in Central America. The Cold War only ended with the Soviet Union's collapse under the guidance of Mikhail Gorbachev, whose government reforms initiated power shifts within the communist bloc. Communist governments started to collapse in Eastern Europe, with the declining Soviet influence, and democratic governments emerged in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Then West and East Germany were reunited in 1989. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, ending the Cold War. While the Declaration of Independence did declare that all men are created equal, the institution of slavery and prevalence of bigotry throughout American history meant that African Americans had an uphill struggle to make that Declaration of Equality ring true. Despite slavery being abolished in 1865, and the addition of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution in 1868 and 1870, which strengthened the legal rights of freed slaves, the fact that slavery had been the law of the land for nearly 100 years cast a long shadow. Legalized segregation policies as well as everyday racism and bigotry meant that in many places, black people and white people were not allowed to occupy the same public spaces such as buses, restrooms, hospitals, prisons, and schools. At the turn of the century, conservative Democrats in the South passed policies that disenfranchised African Americans further through various social, economic, and political means, such as being prevented from voting, occasionally by violent methods. These customs were further solidified in 1896 by the Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, when the court upheld the arrest of a black man named Homer Plessy for his refusal to relinquish his seat on a New Orleans train to a white man, as Louisiana state law demanded. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane, the court said in its ruling. The court continued to apply the same reasoning to its rulings on segregation issues in the subsequent years, confirming laws that provided various rules for blacks and whites, laws which were referred to as Jim Crow, a derogatory term for a black man. All of segregation was not caused by laws, however. Discriminatory traditions like excluding black people from some jobs, housing developments, or stores were also prevalent. During these decades, communities battled to desegregate the South and eliminate disenfranchising measures. In 1950, tired of overcrowded, underfunded inferior schools, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had invested decades of effort combating racial segregation in education, assembled its strongest legal argument against racial segregation in public schools. Brown versus Board of Education. Brown v. Board was in fact a consolidation of 5 cases, which all brought a challenge to the assertion that it was constitutional for public schools to be segregated by law on a racial basis. The challenge was spearheaded by attorney Thurgood Marshall, who contended that the facilities were inherently unequal when they were separate. In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously agreed with Marshall and ended racial segregation in schools through a legal ruling, overruling the established doctrine by Plessy. Although this was a great triumph for civil rights leaders, in practice, it did little to bring an end to school segregation immediately, because it was met with defiance by racist whites who were opposed to their children attending school with black children. At the same time, resistance to segregation in seating on public transit was also building, a battle that had been brought to the forefront by the actions of Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress and civil rights activist in 1955. When she refused to yield her seat in the colored section of a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white male. Parks was arrested and fined, but her efforts encouraged local black leaders to launch the Montgomery bus boycott, which was orchestrated by a young Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. During the boycott, 40,000 African Americans who comprised the majority of the riders on the city bus refused to use the buses in protest of how they were treated. At first, the demands were merely for courtesy, black drivers being hired, and a first-come first-seated basis, with whites being seated from the front doors of the bus, and blacks from the back doors as was the tradition. But during the protest period that spanned well over a year, the objectives evolved to removing the policy of segregated seating completely. On June 5, 1956, a Montgomery federal court declared that any law mandating racially segregated seating on buses was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and the Supreme Court affirmed the ruling of the lower court when the city appealed. The city's buses were integrated December 21, 1956, and the boycott was over. It had lasted over a year and is considered the first large-scale demonstration against racial segregation in the U.S. Civil rights leaders were winning battles, yet the path to equality was a long and hard one. The buses might be integrated, but the bus stops were still segregated, and the new legislation was greeted with heavy resistance and violence. In one case, snipers fired into a bus and broke both legs of a pregnant African-American author. In January 1957, 4 black churches and the residences of some of the leading black leaders in the Montgomery area were bombed. In 1956, a group of Southern congressmen and senators signed the Southern Manifesto, which stated they would oppose racial integration by any legal means. Following the ruling in Brown v. Board, state and local governments, and several Southern states braced against school integration, and members of the general public resisted as well. When 9 African-American students tried to enter Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in September 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had the state National Guard stand in their way on the first day of school, September 2. 2 days subsequent, a hostile mob joined the National Guard again to bar the way of the 9 students going to class. By the last of the month, September 23, the 9 were escorted by the Little Rock police and were trying to enter the school through a side entrance when another irate mob emerged and attempted to follow them into the school. Feeling threatened by the lives of the students, officials ordered them back home. In turn, President Dwight Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and dispatched U.S. Army troops to the location to personally protect the students, who were eventually able to resume normal classes, although they still had to suffer threats and harassment. Non-violent demonstrations against segregation, like sit-ins at white-only lunch counters and the 1961 Freedom Rides, were hallmarks of technique employed by civil rights activists, demonstrating against segregation in public places across the South. Such protests only grew during the administration of John F. Kennedy, when hundreds of demonstrations broke out nationally, attracting national and international media attention, as well as hostility and violence. Freedom Riders, who were interracial members of the student activist organization, Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, encountered fierce resistance when they protested segregation on interstate buses and bus stations by traveling from Washington, D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi. Even though there had been a federal court decision in 1946 stating segregation in interstate transportation was against the law, they were resisted and arrested in Virginia, and brutally beaten in South Carolina, and greeted by a group of more than 100 angry people, including angry members of the local police force and members of the Ku Klux Klan when they arrived in Anniston, Alabama. The violence that erupted there led the rides to be discontinued, although efforts persisted on a smaller level. The publicity engendered by the efforts, along with Dr. King acting as spokesman for the rides as they became nationally recognized, led to the Kennedy administration ordering the Interstate Commerce Commission to prohibit segregation in all the buses and terminals it regulated. The ruling came into effect on November 1, 1961. Although King himself did not participate in the rides are noted for demonstrating to him and others in the campaign that nonviolent peaceful protest against white Southerners' violence could attract strong national media interest, win sympathy for the cause, and provoke federal intervention. During the spring of 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, organized by Dr. King, initiated a mass campaign involving sit-ins, meetings, boycotts of integrated stores, and marches in Birmingham, Alabama, against segregation there, in collaboration with the local activist organization, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, ACMHR. People were registered to vote by activists, heard speeches by King regarding the philosophy of nonviolence in simulated sit-ins. The boycotts against the local businesses were especially effective because they were occurring just before Easter, the second most active time of the year for shopping. Hundreds were arrested to fill the local jails. The city government received a state court order after approximately a week that stated the protests had to cease, but the activists chose to disobey it. The action continued on May 2nd, when over 1,000 African American students walked through downtown Birmingham in what was dubbed the Children's Crusade. Hundreds more were also arrested, filling the jails. The City Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull O'Connor, sanctioned the use of high-pressure hoses to break up child protesters, and when adult spectators responded with stones and bottles thrown at the persons wielding the hoses, Connor called for the deployment of police dogs against them. Photographs of the brutality appalled the country and the world. Under pressure, the White House dispatched a facilitator to assist in accelerating negotiations between protest leaders and members of Birmingham's business leadership, who were crumbling under the persistent boycott. On May 8th, the group reached an agreement. Street demonstrations would stop at once, and signs reading whites only and blacks only on restrooms and water fountains would be taken down. The Birmingham Truce also mandated the release of arrested demonstrators on bail, a proposal to desegregate lunch counters, and the employment of additional African Americans for jobs throughout the city. It was not all that the protesters had hoped it would be, but instead, a partial victory that was controversial with activists who believed that the protesters should have waited until all their objectives were accomplished. The city was gradually desegregated in the subsequent months following the truce, but the campaign was not an enormous local success. Far more than its influence on the passage of the Civil Rights Act was the level of national and global focus it brought to the civil rights movement. It also made King's image as a leader grow immensely. On August 28, King gave his I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was held in the nation's capital to protest African American civil and economic rights. It is estimated that 250,000 attended, and so the assembly, organized in conjunction with DC police, was a logistical success. The march aimed to challenge the reality that many jobs were completely shut off to black applicants, and those available to them paid low wages or provided limited upward mobility. The year 1963 was the centennial anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the proclamation of the abolition of slavery, and organizers of the march hoped to mark the fact that change was past due. The march united many varied activists and organizers, but it was King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial that became immortalized as a work of rhetorical genius in that it demanded an end to racism. The march and the speech are also responsible for encouraging the federal government to take action on civil rights through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned race, color, religion, sex, or national origin discrimination in public accommodations, public education, and employment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned racial discrimination when voting. These were the two most important pieces of civil rights legislation to be passed since the Reconstruction period, and brought many of the Jim Crow policies to an end. No war better represented the U.S. Cold War policy of intervening in elective battles with communist regimes, even in adverse situations, than the Vietnam War. Commanded by the highly anti-communist politician, Nhan Dinh Diem, who was a repressive dictator in his own right however, who ordered the arrest and torture of suspected communist sympathizers, the South Vietnamese battled the communist North Vietnamese for control of the nation. In 1964, during President Lyndon Johnson's administration, the U.S. initiated routine bombing of North Vietnamese targets, but by dropping bombs in a program called Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. also covertly dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on North Vietnamese supply routes and neighboring Laos between 1964 to 1973, even though the nation was neutral in the conflict. In 1965, Johnson requested a large number of American troops be sent to Vietnam. In June 1965, 82,000 combat troops had already been deployed to Vietnam. In late July, 100,000 troops were sent, and another 100,000 were sent in 1966. South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand also deployed troops, but in much lower numbers. China and the Soviet Union supported North Vietnam. By November 1967, American forces in Vietnam numbered almost 500,000, but the war was becoming increasingly unpopular. A robust anti-war movement in America spawned protests against the draft, the enormous number of civilian dead the war was creating, and against the U.S. support for the corrupting Southern Vietnamese dictatorship. Most troops in Vietnam were also low in morale, with numerous indulging in drugs, starting mutinies, and suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. During the years 1966 to 1973, over 503,000 US servicemen deserted, and another 500,000 evaded the draft. However, when President Nixon came into office, he proclaimed that he felt there was a silent majority of people who supported the war. In the following years, the casualty list mounted, among them the over 400 unarmed civilian American soldiers who died in the village of My Lai in 1968. Peace negotiations were a failure. Anti-war feelings in America only intensified. More than 250,000 people marched to protest against the war on November 15, 1969, in Washington, D.C. Nixon closed the draft in 1972, shifting to an all-volunteer army. But in 1971, leaked Pentagon papers had exposed findings of a covert DoD report, which indicated Nixon's administration had deepened war in Vietnam, further siphoning off the war from the public. The United States and North Vietnam brought open hostilities to an end in January 1973, though fighting between South and North Vietnam endured until 1975. When the North occupied the southern city of Saigon, the US attempt had been defeated, and the 20-year conflict cost an enormous price. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese were killed, and 3 million were injured, and another 12 million were forced to become refugees. Approximately 58,000 Americans died. Most anti-war Americans lost faith in their government, and other Americans who were pro-war no longer thought they were invincible. The war split the US bitterly, and its effects would be felt for decades. After World War II had concluded in 1946, the capitalistic United States and the Communist Soviet Union developed tensions between them, as both nations desired to demonstrate their economic system to be superior to the other one, and display to the world that they possessed the key to political dominance. Both nations wanted to prove their superiority technologically by being the first country to send a human into space, something at the time still an as yet unaccomplished feat that both knew was within a few years' reach. Both nations had built intercontinental missiles, which yielded essential electronic technology and rocketry that could lift small cargoes into orbit. The competition started on August 2, 1955. When initially the US, later the USSR, stated that they planned to put artificial satellites into space. After 2 years, on October 4, 1957, the USSR was the first to put its satellite, Sputnik 1, into space, which was the first ever Earth-orbiting satellite in history. They followed it up with the Sputnik 2 the following month, and this time the satellite had on board a dog called Laika, who was the first living creature to be put into orbit. It wasn't until the next January 31, 1958, that the US joined the fray by launching and placing in orbit the satellite Explorer 1. In 1958, the US established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, an agency of the federal government that is charged with the civil space program, aeronautics programs and space research. The US launched the world's first communication satellite, SCORE, on December 18, 1958. It gained global attention when it transmitted a pre-recorded message from US President Dwight D. Eisenhower on Christmas. It was the first time that a human voice had been broadcast from space. In August 1959, the US launched Explorer 6, the world's first weather satellite. It photographed the Earth for the first time from space. The USSR, in September, sent Luna 2, the first spacecraft to land on the surface of the Moon, but unmanned was only the start. In August of 1960, the USSR's Sputnik 5 returned its contents first: 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, and a few plants, alive from space. The US equals this feat the next year, bringing back Ham, a chimpanzee alive from space. Whereas the initial 5 years of the space race had reflected largely comparable capability, the USSR shot into a distinct lead on the 12th of April 1961, with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin aboard the Vostok 1 becoming the first human to enter space. Gagarin circled the world once, a feat that took nearly 2 hours. This achievement pushed the competition into the next decade in greater intensity. In September 1962, US President John F. Kennedy declared that the US would place humans on the Moon and safely return them to Earth by the end of the decade. This address is best recalled for his statement, "We choose to go to the moon." Increasing numbers of government and private individuals became engaged in the US space race, indicating the heat of the rivalry, with figures increasing from 36,000 individuals who participated in 1960 to 377,000 by 1965. In May 1961, the US sent Alan Shepard up on the Mercury Redstone 3, and although Shepard became the first American to travel to space, he could not achieve orbit. Flight time was only some 15 minutes. In subsequent years, the Soviet Union duplicated its successes, launching the first woman into space in 1963. Valentina Tereshkova spent 3 days orbiting the planet on Vostok 6 and opening the door to the first spacewalk when cosmonaut Alexei Leonov exited his ship for 12 minutes in 1965. While the USSR gained a clear advantage on manned missions, the US obtained another victory with its satellite program. On the 14th of July, 1965, the American spacecraft Mariner 4 became the first satellite to journey to Mars and capture close-up photos of the planet's surface. Manned missions were not abandoned by the US despite tragedy. During January of 1967, 3 American astronauts were killed when a fire occurred within their capsule while it was still on the launch pad. Later in the next year, though, the US spaceship Apollo 8 was the first manned vehicle to travel to the moon, circle it, and then come back to Earth. With this triumph, the US realized that it was time to go all out on mission to the moon. In July 1969, the following year, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first 2 men to take steps on the moon. The Apollo 11 televised landing was broadcast globally, earning the US what individuals perceived as victory in the space race. The Soviet Union shifted its attention to the construction of a space station, which it completed in 1971. In 1972, the Soviet Union and the US negotiated the warming of relations, which opened the way to cooperation in space travel. The first joint space mission of the 2 nations was in 1975. The Apollo and Soyuz spacecrafts went into orbit independently and then docked in space, and their 2 commanders shook hands, which symbolized the end of the space race. From then on, the 2 nations made their future missions a collaborative effort, such as the Shuttle Mir mission in 1993. The space race had implications for the world beyond the creation of spaceflight technology. The competition to put humans into space led to the creation of other ubiquitous technology, such as communication and weather satellites, which are utilized today for broadband and GPS applications. The imaging technology in CAT scans was originally created during the space race to create deep space photography. NASA also developed innovations in shock-absorbing material, which proved helpful in the creation of more efficient artificial limbs, and wireless headsets were initially created for astronauts to wear in space. In response to the tragedies initiated by totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century, there emerged in the 1970s a new school of thought called postmodernism. Postmodernism was very skeptical of the assertion that there existed any sort of universal truth, rather relative truths and morals. The postmodernist era coincided with a cultural shift that occurred as the baby boomers reached adulthood. In the 1970s, these youth carried forward activist movements initiated in the 1960s, protesting the school of thought policy of the older generation. Students marched by the thousands against the Vietnam War and the draft, and against the manufacturer of napalm, Dow Chemical. There were not always peaceful anti-war protests on college campuses. Others became violent, such as the May 1970 shooting at Kent State University in Ohio, where 13 students were shot by members of the National Guard. During these years, individuals also protested against discrimination against women, racial segregation, and other areas. The first Earth Day was celebrated on April 22, 1970. Television and radio were everywhere, with such programs as All in the Family, Saturday Night Live, and Wheel of Fortune debuting. This decade also experienced the introduction of the first successful home video game system, the Atari 2600, and the creation of computer companies Apple and Microsoft. Meanwhile, the US economy was in recession, and gasoline prices were through the roof because of the Arab oil embargo placed upon the nations that had aided Israel during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The US was also experiencing political instability, with illegal acts done in the name of re-electing President Richard Nixon, exposed in the Watergate scandal, and leading to the collapse of Nixon's administration. The Watergate scandal severely tainted the reputation of the Republican Party, so in 1976 Democrat Jimmy Carter was elected to the presidency. Carter focused on soothing hostilities across the globe, and in a significant treaty, he agreed to a nuclear weapons reduction with the Soviet Union and returned the Panama Canal to Panama. Most importantly, he facilitated a peace accord in the Middle East where war had raged since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But Carter's backing of the Shah of Iran, who desired to modernize and westernize Iran, eventually became controversial. By 1979, the Shah was unpopular and was toppled, at which point anti-American sentiment grew in the nation. A group took over the U.S. embassy in Iran, and 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage for the next 444 days. After this Iran hostage crisis, a second energy crisis emerged, and gasoline prices skyrocketed once more. During the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan won in a landslide against Carter. In the 80s, social issues were put on the back burner and personal financial achievement became most everyone's main objective. The populist conservative movement of the New Right had started to gain steam in the late 70s into the early 80s. Reagan campaigned for deregulating business, cutting back government expenditure, and providing tax cuts to individuals and corporations. The tax reduction plan was part of a system that was referred to as supply-side economics, or the assumption that the ensuing benefits for companies would find its way to everyone, eventually. Collectively, these economic policies came to be referred to as Reaganomics. In 1982, the worst economic recession in the United States since the Great Depression hit the country. 9 million individuals were out of work in November of that year. However, Reaganomics was still favored because it enriched the wealthy. During the 1980s, the average family income of those in the richest 1% rose considerably and much higher than that of middle-class families, which crept up modestly while earnings for the poorest 40% of families fell. TV had invaded almost every home and was becoming increasingly diverse with the debut of Cheers, The Simpsons, and The Cosby Show. Also in vogue was television news, which provided new levels of publicity for such crimes as child abduction through vehicles such as 60 Minutes. Individuals also discovered catastrophes abroad, including the Ethiopian famine. The July 13, 1985 Live Aid benefit concert was viewed by an estimated 1.5 billion viewers and generated millions of dollars in relief money for the famine. In 1986, the audience watched as the United Way, the Cleveland, Ohio branch, tried to break the record for most balloons released simultaneously, but the publicity event meant to be light-hearted was soon out of control. A 1.5 million balloon cloud of colorful helium balloons was released, but wind-driven and rain-pushed. They led an airport to close and disrupted efforts by the Coast Guard to locate 2 fishermen in distress off nearby waters. The balloons blocked waterways and brought about traffic crashes and were viewed as a great environmental catastrophe. The US returned to space in 1981 with the Space Shuttle Columbia, the very first reusable space exploration vehicle. The US flew numerous shuttle missions in the 80s, though one was marked by tragedy. Millions watched live in 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded seconds after takeoff, killing all 7 aboard. This grounded the space program for 2.5 years until the Discovery was launched in 1988. Reagan's foreign policy was aggressive, and he was quick to engage the US in circumstances overseas where communism seemed poised to dominate. The US extended financial and military aid to the regimes of Grenada, El Salvador, and Nicaragua under this Reagan doctrine. But in 1986, it emerged that the US had sold arms to Iran even when the country was under an arms ban, which was a penalty imposed in retaliation for the invasion of the US Embassy in 1979. Reagan administration members sold the arms to Iran in an attempt to illegally use proceeds from the sales to fund a rebel army called the Contras, who were battling the socialist Sandinista government of Nicaragua. The administration was scandalized, and investigations of the problem were hindered due to the number of documents that had been shredded or withheld. A number of administration officials were found guilty of Iran-Contra-related crimes, though all were vacated or pardoned. Yet another Reagan administration scandal was uncovered subsequently following examination of its handling of the 1980s AIDS epidemic. Although US health officials had known of the AIDS virus since 1981, US leaders were quiet during the initial stages of the epidemic. Only in 1985, when AIDS had already killed 3,500 and infected over 7,700 individuals, did the government fund AIDS research. And it wasn't until 1987 that the federal government really started promoting AIDS awareness, but by then, an estimated 47,000 Americans already had HIV, the virus that leads to AIDS. The problem had mostly been dismissed, because it was considered only to be happening to sexually active gay men. But throughout the 1980s, AIDS became a top cause of death in all young adults. By 1990, over 100,000 individuals in the US had perished of AIDS. Receiving much more federal consideration was an epidemic of a different sort: drugs. Crack cocaine was sold as smokable, solid pieces that were inexpensive and very prevalent in large US cities in 1985. Crack especially hit poor communities dwelling in cities that had large populations of African Americans. Dealers of drugs helped fuel a great deal of violence in these communities. During the period from 1984 to 1989, young black men's homicide rate increased more than 2 times, and black communities experienced increases in fetal death, low birth weight infants, arrests for weapons possession, and children in foster care. In 1986, the U.S. Congress enacted legislation that criminalized possession or dealing of crack cocaine, 100 times more harshly than that of powdered cocaine, something that was broadly perceived as being aimed at low-income African Americans more likely to be consuming inexpensive crack, instead of the higher-cost powder or other illegal drugs, such as crystal methamphetamine. This led to severe social ramifications, such as heightened police brutality against black Americans, and large numbers of young black men incarcerated on narcotics convictions for lengthy sentences, which in turn led them to lose the right to vote, housing, and employment opportunity, which in turn induced high rates of violent crime in low-income black neighborhoods. Although President Nixon opened the so-called war on drugs in the 1970s, President Reagan considerably broadened the federal campaign to prevent drug use and to prosecute users. In 1984, Reagan signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which increased the federal penalties for possession, cultivation, or sale of marijuana, created minimum sentences, and ended parole for federal prisoners. Between 1980 and 1984, the federal annual budget of FBI's drug enforcement units rose from $8 million to $95 million. When George H.W. Bush assumed the presidency in 1989, he picked up where Reagan left off. During his first television address as president, Bush held up a plastic baggie containing white chalky pieces, calling it crack cocaine. "It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones," he declared. Drug use was really declining in 1989, but Bush proceeded to spend $45 billion for the most part on drug enforcement law, which was greater than the combined total of the last 4 administrations. It was later discovered that Bush's baggie, which allegedly had been confiscated from a drug bust only days earlier, mere steps from the White House in Lafayette Park, was a staged operation. A federal undercover agent had enticed a teenage drug dealer into the park before arresting him, to make it appear the president's doorstep was on the drug trade. Another significant event during Bush's term was the Gulf War. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, sought to nationalize Kuwait and gain control of its oil fields so that it would control much of the world's oil supply. Since the US and other nations desired continued access to these fields, they united in a coalition to halt the invasion. From January 16, 1991, there was an air as well as ground war, with troops from the US, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Kuwait. Handily, they defeated the Iraqi army, retreating out of Kuwait a mere month later, on February 28. The effects of the war were felt up into the 21st century. From 1990 to 1997, the number of households in America with computers went from 15% to 35%. This mass popularity of personal computers and the World Wide Web propelled the information technology market into the stratosphere, and investors and entrepreneurs around the globe were seeking entry means to a piece of the pie. By 1998, investors were drawn by the promise of profitability of .com companies, low interest rates, and the availability of venture capital, and were willing to finance almost any company with a .com in its title, while paying no attention to conventional indicators of success. That is the capacity to make a profit or even a business plan of any sort. Even those companies which never earned any revenue during the peak of the boom could go public by floating an initial public offering or IPO and raising funds. On paper, individuals overnight became billionaires. The Nasdaq Composite Index, a highly scrutinized stock market indicator, increased by 582% from January 1995 to March 2000. The scenario was dangerous, however, since the firms were significantly overpriced because they did not have a strategy for becoming profitable. They were being examined instead for their capacity to draw internet traffic. Speculation, or buying risky stocks cheaply in the hope that the price will increase sufficiently to allow an eventual profit. The dot-com speculation bubble was nothing but a house of cards. When investment capital started to dwindle, most of the firms that had created so much hype went broke, and the bubble collapsed. Panic in the market led to huge sellouts, and by 2002, investor losses from the dot-com bubble totaled an estimated $5 trillion. The bursting of the dot-com bubble is credited with contributing to an 8-month recession in the economy that began in March 2001. But the recession was one of the mildest in the history of the nation, and not all dot-com-era companies were lost to bankruptcy. Some of the survivors went on to become the giants with which we are now familiar: Microsoft, Amazon, eBay, Qualcomm, and Cisco. Following a record turnout, Barack Obama became the first African American to be elected to office as President of the US, with over 10 million votes in the popular vote, and obtaining a huge majority in electoral votes. Obama's theme was hope, and it caught with the American people. As the war of terror continued, economic hardship in the home front added to the sense of insecurity. In 2008, defaults on a rapidly falling US housing market triggered a cascade of losses in the global financial market, resulting in a severe and prolonged economic slump called the Great Recession. The recession was the worst economic decline in the US after the Great Depression of 1929. There were thousands of Americans who failed to make their loan repayments and lost their businesses, and businesses went under as the US government rushed to try to mitigate the loss. In 2009, with the leadership of newly elected President Barack Obama, the Congress enacted a string of acts to ease the problems that had been brought on by the recession and to implement reforms so it could never be a problem again. In 2013, the Afghan military officially took control of operations in their nation, and the US announced plans for a full US withdrawal by 2016. In the 2016 election, Republican nominee Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton battled it out in one of the most horrific elections that had ever been seen. As Clinton campaigned on her extensive experience within the federal government, Trump's campaign was anything but typical. Trump was able to capitalize on a segment of Americans who had felt they'd been marginalized over the past few years, as well as individuals who mistrusted the government. Clinton lost the election to Trump, who won most of the electoral votes. Soon after, suspicion of Russian and Chinese interference in the tampering with the election surfaced. In 2017, President Donald Trump was sworn in and countermanded the scheduled withdrawal as an insurgent entity known as the Islamic State emerged in Afghanistan. Trump cleared the deployment of the US's most massive non-nuclear bomb in an operation which coincided with his decision to maintain the US's military presence on the ground. 2 years later, the US and Taliban again resumed peace talks, and after a series of mutual cancellations, an agreement was finally reached in 2020. Early 2020 saw the emergence of a new strain of virus from Wuhan, China. By mid-March 2020, there was a reported positive case of COVID-19 in all 50 states of the US, and almost all of the new cases were due to community spread, rather than by contracting the infection overseas. The COVID-19 pandemic weighed heavily on Americans economically, politically, and psychologically, and exposed profound differences among Americans' perceptions of the role of government during a crisis, specifically concerning vaccine mandates. During 2020, the country once again endured a contentious and divisive election. Incumbent Donald Trump, seeking re-election, opposed former Vice President Joe Biden at the peak of the pandemic. Once more, issues of racial injustice in the homeland, gun control, and Supreme Court appointments were the prime issues of the race. As the ongoing medical crisis further polarized the parties, the physical and psychological toll of the pandemic became a focal point for both candidates. following a hotly disputed election in which the tally took longer than usual, owing to COVID-19 pandemic-induced early election and mail-in votes. Biden was elected president, sweeping most electoral votes and the popular vote. Trump and the Republicans contested the outcome of the election as soon as it was declared. Trump would insist again and again that the election had been stolen and heightened skepticism toward the American electoral process. On the 6th of January 2021, when the U.S. Congress was gathered to certify the election, massive groups of Trump supporters organized by Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, both far-right anti-government extremist groups with links to white supremacist groups, plotted to occupy the U.S. Capitol building and compelled the Congress to certify the election as a scam and declare Trump the rightful president. On the 6th of January, the riot outside the Capitol building broke through security and into the Capitol, sending the Congress running and Capitol Police using force in a few instances. After the police had finally cleared the building, the counting of electoral votes was resumed, and Vice President Pence declared Biden the victor. In 2021, Joe Biden took office as president with Vice President Kamala Harris, the first African American and first woman to serve in the office. Under President Joe Biden, the U.S. military finally started its last pullout from Afghanistan. As it did, the Taliban soon filled the void and overthrew the weak Afghan government, reversing all that had been accomplished for the past 20 years. The next year, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded the Republic of Ukraine, and the United States started sending aid to the nation to fight Russia's expansion into the area. Now Biden's administration still advances progressive policies domestically and internationally, and still struggles against the extreme political divide in the nation. With the 2024 election on the horizon, the fate of the United States appears to rest in the balance. Since the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the country has weathered great and sometimes violent political, social, and economic upheaval, but is in itself the very characteristic of the United States that, in spite of the tribulation and affliction, she always remains whole and strong as ever. In January 2025, the United States underwent another test when deadly wildfires raged across Los Angeles County, one of the deadliest and costliest fire disasters in the history of California. Being provoked by extreme drought, low humidity, and strong Santa Ana winds of up to 100 miles per hour, the Palisades and Eaton fires torched more than 37,000 acres, left over 12,000 buildings in ashes, and resulted in at least 29 fatalities. The blazes compelled more than 200,000 residents to flee, with whole communities including affluent neighborhoods such as Altadena and Pacific Palisades reduced to ash. Firefighters were hindered by such challenges as low-pressure water supply and budget constraints that restricted their ability to respond, while unauthorized drones caused interferences with aerial firefighting operations. Through such challenges, the resolve of Los Angeles firefighters and residents was revealed as they labored round the clock to put out the fires, completing the full containment on January 31, 2025. Federal and state assistance, along with a major disaster declaration and $2.5 billion in relief funds, aided the recovery process, highlighting the country's ability to come together when faced with natural disasters. In the 2025 India-Pakistan War, which broke out in the form of a short but fierce 4-day war from May 7 to May 10, the United States under President Donald Trump found itself playing the role of a principal mediator, although this one is extremely disputed. The clash was a result of rising tensions over Kashmir and cross-border raids, with India carrying out aerial bombardment of Pakistani targets after a terror attack prompted India to undertake retaliatory measures and shoot down fighter jets on either side. Trump kept insisting on taking sole credit for preventing a nuclear buildup, saying that he acted by threatening Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi with harsh trade tariffs and the suspension of any US-India trade agreement should fighting persist, while also working with Pakistani leaders to calm down. Pakistan officially credited the ceasefire to US mediation, with its government going as far as nominating Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize for his diplomatic efforts during the crisis, citing his success in averting greater regional tragedy. Indian officials strongly refuted any serious American role, claiming that the ceasefire was bilaterally negotiated between New Delhi and Islamabad, with no third-party broker, and that US phone calls were incidental rather than crucial. Trump's exaggerated claims of U.S. influence were used to promote his image as a world peacemaker, critics claimed, while core U.S. strategic interests, such as the defense of alliances with nuclear-armed countries in the face of Chinese competition, motivated silent back-channel diplomacy. In defiance of denials, U.S. intelligence assistance was indeed provided to India on Pakistani nuclear sites during the build-up, highlighting its stake in forestalling dangerous escalation that would upset South Asian stability and international trade. Finally, America's contribution seemed more enabling than transformative, serving to accelerate a ceasefire but not deep-seatedly altering the historical Indo-Pakistani conflict. The 2025 Iran-Israel war, which lasted 12 days from June 13th and was characterized by airstrikes, missile retaliations, and U.S. direct involvement, found the United States firmly on Israel's side, moving from defensive backup to offensive strikes on Iranian targets. The war broke out when Israel carried out preemptive attacks on Iranian military and nuclear facilities, citing critical threats from the Iranian nuclear program and proxy operations. Iran responded with drone and missile attacks, leading U.S. troops to intercept attacks and protect Israeli airspace. On June 21st, the United States entered offensively with 3 Iranian nuclear facilities bombed in Operation Midnight Hammer, the White House characterizing it as destroying Tehran's nuclear capacity. Though Iran challenged the severity of the damage and called for accountability for what it styled a war of aggression, President Trump, while at first disputing direct attacks on Iran, eventually characterized U.S. entry as safeguarding American troops in the region and a way to compel a deal, calling for the sides to be propelled toward peace during ceasefire talks. The U.S. mobilized a multinational force with France, Jordan, and Britain to neutralize Iranian projectiles, demonstrating a wider NATO-type response to perceived Iranian aggression. The casualties were asymmetrical, with Iran losing more than 600 troops to Israel's 28, illustrating U.S.-Israeli military superiority. Critics, such as Iranian officials and some American analysts, blamed America for bias, allowing Israeli escalation and threatening broader regional war potentially involving Russia or China. Post-ceasefire, Trump's administration urged the creation of a new road in the Middle East, capitalizing on the conflict to breathe new life into models such as the Abraham Accords. Although critics saw U.S. actions as favoring Israeli security at the expense of greater de-escalation, locking in instability while diverting attention from domestic concerns, America's role thus changed from ally to co-belligerent, reaffirming its strategic commitment to Israel, but at the expense of increased tensions with Iran and possible future blowback. The glory of the United States and its citizens lies in their resilience and its capacity to transform and evolve. The United States is still a world leader to be respected and revered today. Its over 334 million people make it one of the most diverse nations on the globe. Its terrain is colored with some of the most beautiful natural landmarks in the world, with dozens of official national and historical parks, preserves, monuments, and sites maintained by the federal government. From the simplest of origins, the citizens of the United States of America have struggled for what they knew was right, and still do even today. The unyielding American spirit, which defines the best of Americans, has brought the nation to unprecedented heights in the fields of politics, science, business, and arts. And though far from flawless, the people of America are always reaching out for greatness, never stopping to prove themselves worthy of the magnificent experiment initiated by their revolution almost 250 years ago.